She had 48 hours to save everything she had ever loved, or sell herself to the most feared man in the territory. Evelyn Mercer was 50 years old, sun-hardened, sharp-eyed, and had never once begged for anything in her life. But the morning her father came home with trembling hands and hollow eyes, she understood that begging might be the kindest thing left to her. The debt was real. The deadline was real. And the man her father had gone to, Caleb Draven, was as real and as dangerous as a loaded rifle left cocked on a kitchen table. If this story moves something in you, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this tale has traveled. Like, stay with us until the very last word, because this ending will surprise you. The spring of 1876 came in wrong. That was the only way Evelyn Mercer could describe it years later when she sat on the porch of a house she had not yet imagined and tried to trace the thread that had pulled her life apart and then stitched it back together in a shape she never expected. The spring came in wrong. Too cold, too quiet, too still. The kind of stillness that settled over the land the way it settled over a man's face right before he delivered news that could not be taken back. She felt it in her knees before she heard it in words. She always had been built that way, her body reading the weather of a room faster than her mind could follow. Her mother had called it a gift. Her father had called it spooky. Evelyn had never called it anything except useful. She was mending a bridle on the front steps of the Mercer ranch house when her father's wagon came up the road that Tuesday morning. She knew before the wheels stopped turning that something was broken. Not the wagon, not the horse, something in the man holding the reins. Thomas Mercer was 64 years old and had survived drought, flood, 2 cattle epidemics, a war that had taken his brother, and the death of his wife 11 years prior. He was not a man who folded easily, but he was folded now. "Papa." She set the bridle down and stood, brushing dust from her skirt with a practicality so ingrained she didn't notice she'd done it. "Papa, what happened?" It wasn't a question. She didn't use the inflection of a question. There was no room for it. Thomas Mercer climbed down from the wagon with the careful movements of a man who had grown suddenly old overnight. His hat was in his hands. He'd removed it at some point on the road, which he never did unless he was in church or delivering condolences. He turned it slowly in his fingers, round and round, and he looked at her with eyes that had gone the color of winter ash. "We need to talk inside," he said. "We can talk right here. Evelyn, tell me," he told her. It took him 20 minutes to lay it all out, and Evelyn stood perfectly still through the entire recounting, her arms crossed at her chest, her jaw set in the particular way that the ranch hands had learned to read as "don't push further." Thomas sat on the porch step she had vacated, still turning his hat, and he talked in the halting, ashamed voice of a man who had made decisions he could no longer defend. The debts had begun accumulating 3 years ago, when the first bad season hit and the cattle prices dropped sharply. Thomas had borrowed to cover feed costs, convinced the next year would be better. The next year was not better. He borrowed again. This time at a steeper interest from a man named Aldous Burke, who operated out of the town of Graybend, and who was, as Evelyn now understood, not truly in the business of lending money, but in the business of acquiring property. Burke's rate had compounded with a cruelty that bordered on arithmetic violence. What had begun as a manageable sum had metastasized into something enormous, something that consumed the value of the land twice over. Thomas had tried to renegotiate. Burke had laughed at him. Thomas had tried to sell 2 of the northern pastures quietly to cover the bulk of it. Burke had found out and accelerated the timeline on the debt, citing a clause in the original agreement that Thomas had not read carefully enough. "We have until the end of the month," Thomas said. 31 days. "That's not 31 days of breathing room," Evelyn said quietly. "That's 31 days until Burke takes the land." "Yes." "And the house." "Yes." "And everything we've built on it." Thomas said nothing, which was answer enough. Evelyn looked out across the ranch, the long fence lines she and her father had repaired together after the hard winter of '71, the barn she had helped raise board by board at 17 years old with her mother cheering from the doorway, the garden that had been her mother's and that she had kept alive through sheer stubbornness for 11 years without her. She looked at all of it with the measuring eye of a woman who had learned early that sentiment was a luxury and practicality was survival. "How much?" she asked. He told her the number. She exhaled slowly through her nose. "That's not a debt, Papa. That's a noose." "I know. Did you go to the bank in Gray Bend?" "They won't touch it. Burke has arrangements with the bank. He's done this before, Evelyn. He finds men who are struggling, lends them money they can barely afford, and then he waits. He's patient. He doesn't want the money back. He wants the land. Then we find someone who has more money than Burke and more reason to want us solvent." Thomas turned his hat one more time, and then he stopped turning it. He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw the thing she hadn't seen yet, the thing he'd been working himself toward this entire time. "I already did," he said. The name Caleb Draven landed in the conversation the way a stone dropped into still water, with a heaviness that sent ripples outward in every direction. Evelyn had heard the name her entire life. You couldn't live within 50 miles of the Draven spread and not hear the name. It was spoken differently depending on who was speaking it, with grudging respect by the ranchers who had managed to stay out of his way, with barely concealed fear by those who had crossed him, with the hushed reverence of mythology by the people in town who had built stories around him the way children built forts, enthusiastically and with whatever materials were at hand. Caleb Draven. Age unknown, though guesses ranged from 40 to 60 and were probably all wrong. Owner of the largest single cattle operation in the territory, a spread called Black Creek Ranch that covered terrain so vast it had its own weather systems, or so people claimed, built entirely from nothing. No inheritance, no family money, no partnerships. Just one man with a relentless will, and depending on who was telling the story, either ruthless business cunning or a genuine willingness to destroy anyone who stood in his way. She had seen him exactly once, 3 years prior, at a cattle auction in Gray Bend. He had stood apart from the other buyers, which was itself remarkable. Auctions were social occasions for most ranchers, chances to gossip and deal and position. Draven had stood with 2 of his men at a slight remove from the crowd and had watched the proceedings with an expression that revealed nothing whatsoever. He was tall, lean, but not spare, the kind of lean that suggested density, substance, like hardwood rather than pine, dark hair going gray at the temples, eyes she couldn't make out from where she'd stood, but which had seemed to catch light in an unsettling way, like a hawk watching a field from a great height. He had purchased 6 bulls at that auction, each time with a single, almost casual gesture of his hand, outbidding everyone else with the air of a man who had already decided the outcome before the thing began. He had not smiled once. He had not spoken to anyone except his own men. That was the totality of Evelyn's personal experience with Caleb Draven. But she was a woman who had spent 50 years listening, and she had listened well, and what she had accumulated over a lifetime of careful attention was this. He was not cruel for the pleasure of cruelty, but he was absolutely unmerciful when he decided someone needed to be unmerciful too. He had broken 3 competing ranchers in the past decade, not through violence but through something almost worse, patience, precision, and an uncanny ability to find the exact point of weakness in an opponent's operation and press it steadily and without relenting until the thing collapsed. Men who had started out as his rivals had ended up selling to him at his price, on his timeline, according to his terms. He had never married. He was never seen in the company of women at social gatherings. He did not attend church, did not participate in town events, did not seek influence through the ordinary channels of community goodwill. He simply existed, out there on Black Creek Ranch, amassing land and cattle and power with the quiet, inexorable momentum of a glacier. And her father had gone to him. "You went to Caleb Draven," Evelyn said. "I had nowhere else to go." "You went to Caleb Draven and asked him for—" She paused because the next word was enormous. "Money. I asked him for help. He offered money. And a condition." The silence that fell between them was the loudest thing Evelyn had heard since her mother's last breath. "What condition?" she said. Thomas Mercer looked at his daughter, his strong, capable, practical, magnificent daughter, who had given the best years of her life to this land without complaint. And he said the words that would change everything. "Marriage," he said. He wants to marry you, Evelyn. That's his price. She walked. That was what she did when the ground shifted beneath her. She walked. She left her father on the porch, left the bridle on the step, left the ranch yard, and moved through the lower pasture with long, purposeful strides that carried her nowhere in particular and everywhere she needed to be. The cattle watched her pass with their enormous, indifferent eyes. The wind off the hills cut through her jacket. She walked until the tightness in her chest loosened enough to allow full breaths, and then she stopped at the fence line at the eastern edge of the lower pasture and stood with her hands on the top rail and looked at the land. Her land. Her mother's land. Her grandfather's land before that. She was 50 years old. She had been married once, briefly, to a man named Robert Wyatt, who had died of fever in the winter of 1855, only 14 months after they'd wed, before children, before roots had grown between them deep enough to grieve properly. She had mourned him as best she could, and then she had come home, and home had claimed her entirely, and she had not thought about marriage again in any serious way. It was not that she was incapable of feeling. She felt everything, deeply, in the private architecture of herself where no one was invited to look. It was simply that the ranch needed her more than any feeling did, and she was, at her core, a woman who went toward what needed her. But this was not need. This was transaction. This was commerce dressed up in the language of matrimony, and she understood it for exactly what it was. She understood something else, too, standing at that fence line with the spring wind in her hair and the weight of the situation settling fully across her shoulders like a yoke. She didn't actually have a choice. Oh, she had the choice to refuse. She could walk back to that porch right now, look her father in his ashamed, hollowed eyes, and say no. She could say absolutely not. This is an outrage. I will not be sold like cattle to settle a debt. She could say all of that and she would be right. Morally, categorically, unambiguously right. And then in 31 days, Aldous Burke would own the Mercer Ranch. Her father would have nothing. The home her mother had built would belong to a predator. The fence line she had repaired with her own hands would mark someone else's property. The garden would go to weeds. The barn would be repurposed or torn down. The cattle her grandfather had brought through 300 miles of hard country to establish this place would be sold off to whoever offered Burke the best price. Everything. Gone. And her father, at 64, with no savings and no prospects, and the particular broken pride of a man who had failed the people he loved, would have nothing left to live for. She knew that with the certainty of a woman who had spent 30 years reading every shift in the weather of his face. The choice was not her freedom versus her principles. The choice was her freedom versus her family's survival. She had always known that there were situations in life where the question was not what is right, but simply what can you bear. She had reached that point. She could feel it like a threshold beneath her feet. She turned and walked back to the house. "Tell me everything he said," she told her father, and she sat down across from him at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she didn't intend to drink, and the expression on her face that meant I am making decisions, not having feelings right now. Thomas told her. He had ridden to Black Creek Ranch 3 days prior, without telling Evelyn, which was itself a measure of how desperate he'd grown, because Thomas Mercer had not kept a secret from his daughter since 1863. He had been received by Draven without appointment, which had surprised him. Apparently, Caleb Draven kept himself apprised of the financial situation of every significant ranch within his operating territory, and Thomas Mercer's arrival had therefore not been entirely unexpected. The conversation had been short. Thomas had explained the situation. Draven had listened without expression. At the end, he had said, "I'll pay Burke the full amount, principal and interest as accumulated, within the week. I'll assume any and all remaining operational debts of the Mercer Ranch. The ranch stays in your name, your cattle remain your cattle, and your daughter and I will be married before the month is out." That was the whole of it. No negotiation, no counteroffer invited. "Did he explain why?" Evelyn asked. "He said he needed a wife. Men who need wives generally pursue them through the ordinary means." "I said as much." "And?" Thomas paused. "He said he'd been watching you manage this ranch for years. He said you were capable. He said," another pause, longer this time, "he said a man in his position needed a woman of substance beside him, not a girl who'd be frightened of what he'd built." Evelyn absorbed this. He's been watching me. That's what he said. That is either a compliment or it's alarming. I think it might be both. She looked at her hands, flat on the table. 50 years of work lived in those hands. Calluses, a scar on the left thumb from a wire fence in 1861. The particular roughness of skin that had spent decades in weather. She looked at them the way she might look at a tool she was deciding whether to trust. I have conditions, she said. Thomas blinked. I'm considering it. I haven't decided. But if I do decide, I have conditions. She looked up at him. I'll need to speak with him directly. Not through intermediaries, not through messages. If this man expects me to upend my life and move on to his property, the least he can do is look me in the face and have an honest conversation. He'll agree to that. You don't know that. He said, Thomas reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. He said to give you this if you wanted to speak with him directly. Evelyn took the paper and unfolded it. The handwriting was spare and deliberate, not elegant, but precise. The kind of handwriting that belonged to a man who had not had the luxury of formal education, but who had compensated through the sheer force of discipline. Miss Mercer, I will receive you at Black Creek Ranch at whatever hour you choose. Come alone or bring whoever you trust. Ask whatever you need to ask. I don't expect you to agree to anything you don't understand fully. C. Draven. She read it twice, then she folded it and set it on the table. He knew you'd show it to me before he asked, she said quietly, almost to herself. What? He knew the first thing I'd want is to speak to him directly, so he prepared for it in advance. She looked up. He's been 3 steps ahead of this conversation since before it started. Thomas said nothing. Evelyn picked up her coffee, found it had gone cold, and drank it anyway. I'll go tomorrow, she said. She drove herself. She had considered, briefly, asking one of the ranch hands to accompany her, but she discarded the idea almost immediately. Bringing someone would suggest she needed the protection, and she refused to arrive at Caleb Draven's door looking like a woman who needed protection. She wore her best practical dress, clean wool, well-fitted, the dark gray one that her mother had always said made her look like she was made of the same stuff as the land. She pinned her hair up with more care than usual, not out of vanity, but out of the same instinct that made her clean her boots before going to town, respect for the occasion, whatever the occasion cost her. The road to Black Creek Ranch was 11 miles of rough territory that climbed through 2 sets of hills before opening onto the high plateau where the Draven spread began. She had never had reason to travel it before, and she found herself studying the land with the automatic assessment of a woman who had spent her life reading terrain. The grass was different here, better managed, the grazing rotated with visible care. The fence lines were immaculate, no sagging wire, no leaning posts, no visible neglect. The creek that ran alongside the road for the last 3 miles was clear and running fast, its banks maintained. Whatever else Caleb Draven was, he was a man who took care of what was his. She arrived at the main yard of Black Creek Ranch at mid-morning and found it already in full operation. Hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a well-run outfit, horses being worked in a far corral, smoke rising from the blacksmith building. The main house surprised her. She had expected something fortress-like, designed to project power and intimidation. Instead, it was large but plain, 2 stories of solid construction, no unnecessary ornamentation, the kind of building that said permanence rather than importance. It had been built by someone who intended to stay. A man came from the barn as her wagon pulled up. One of Draven's men, she assumed, lean and weathered, somewhere in his 40s. He nodded at her with a respect that was matter-of-fact rather than performed. Miss Mercer, he said, Mr. Draven's expecting you. I'll take your horse. Thank you. She climbed down without assistance. He's inside? Around back, the south porch. She found him there. He was standing at the porch rail with a cup of coffee, looking out over the southern range, and he heard her step on the wooden boards and turned before she spoke. Up close, in full daylight, with no auction crowd between them, she had her first real study of Caleb Draven, and she did it with the unsentimental precision she brought to everything. He was older than she'd thought at the auction, closer to 55 than 40, she revised immediately. The gray at his temples had spread since she'd seen him last. threading through the dark in a way that suited him without making him look diminished. His face was the face of a man who had spent his life outdoors, deeply lined, weathered, the kind of face that recorded every hard season it had survived. His eyes, which she could see properly now, were a very dark brown, almost black in the morning light, and they had the stillness of deep water. Nothing agitated on the surface, and no way of knowing how deep it ran. He looked at her the way she was looking at him, direct, unhurried, measuring, not rude, just honest. "Miss Mercer," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected and quieter. "Thank you for coming." "I came because I have questions," she said, "and because I don't make decisions without the full picture." "I'd expect nothing less." He gestured to the chairs on the porch. Plain wooden chairs, functional, arranged to look at the view rather than at each other, which she found unexpectedly thoughtful. "Sit, if you want. I'll get you coffee." "I don't need coffee." "Then sit anyway. This conversation will be easier if you're not standing like you're about to leave." She sat. After a moment, he sat too, at a distance that was respectful without being theatrical. He set his coffee cup on the rail and looked at her with that same unhurried directness. "Ask," he said. She asked everything. She asked about the debt payment, the mechanics of it, the timeline, whether there were hidden conditions that would surface later. He explained it clearly, without impatience. He would ride to Graybend within 3 days of an agreement, settle the full amount with Burke in a single payment, and provide her father with documentation confirming the debt's full extinguishment. The Mercer Ranch would carry no additional obligations to Draven himself. It was not a loan. It was a payment, freely made, with no repayment expected. "Then what do you get?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of evasion, the quiet of a man who is choosing his words with care rather than reaching for easy ones. "I get a wife who knows how to run a ranch," he said finally, "who won't be frightened of this land or this life, who can stand beside me in the position I've built without needing to be managed or protected or explained. You could find that in a younger woman. Younger women want things I can't offer. Romance, children, most of them, a social life, a husband who goes to parties and dances." He looked at her steadily. "I've been honest with myself long enough to know I'm not that man. I don't have it in me, and I stopped pretending otherwise 20 years ago. I'm looking for a partner, Miss Mercer, not a possession." She studied him. "People will say I married you for the money. People will say whatever they want. They always have. It doesn't bother you." "What people say stopped mattering to me a long time ago." A pause. "Does it bother you?" She considered the question honestly. "Not the way it might bother another woman," she said. "But I have a father who has to live in this territory, and a reputation I've spent 50 years building through actual work. I won't have it reduced to a transaction." "Then don't let it be reduced." His voice was even. "How you carry this is your business. I won't interfere with it." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something disconcerting about talking to a man who didn't perform, who didn't try to charm her or reassure her or sell himself to her. He simply sat there and was exactly what he was, without apology or embellishment, and let her make of it what she would. "I have more conditions," she said. "Tell me." "My own room. My own space in whatever house I'm living in. I don't know you. You don't know me. We'll need time to understand who the other person is before anything else is expected." Agreed. She had expected resistance, or at least negotiation. His immediate agreement threw her slightly. She pushed on. "My father is included in this. Whatever arrangement we make, he is not discarded. He's not a charity case, and he's not a burden you're inheriting. He's a man who made mistakes and who deserves his dignity intact." Something shifted in Draven's expression. Barely perceptible, but she caught it. Something that might, in a different light, have been respect. "What exactly are you asking for him?" "Nothing specific right now. I'm asking for the principle, that he is treated as a man, not a problem." "Agreed," he said again. "I will run your household as I see fit. I'm not taking direction on domestic matters from men who haven't run a household in their lives." The faintest thing, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, moved across his face. I haven't had a household to run in 20 years, he said. I've had a place to sleep and eat. The distinction has not been lost on me. Then we understand each other on that point. We do. She stood up. He stood too, immediately, which surprised her. It was the gesture of a man who'd been taught to stand when a woman stood, which meant someone had taught him manners at some point, regardless of what reputation he'd accumulated since. I haven't agreed to anything yet, she said. I know. I need 3 days. Take whatever you need. She looked at him one more time, this complicated, weathered, reputation-wrapped, unexpectedly quiet man. And she tried to read him the way she read weather, the way she read land, the way she had read people for 50 years with a success rate good enough to have kept her alive and functional through considerable hardship. What she found was not what she had expected. She had come prepared for threat, veiled or open. She had come prepared for arrogance, for the casual condescension of a powerful man who assumed the outcome was already settled. She had come prepared for manipulation dressed up as generosity. She had not come prepared for the thing she actually found, which was a man who was lonely in a way so deep and so long established that he had built an entire reputation on top of it like a wall, and who was offering her in the only language he apparently knew, which was the language of direct transaction, something that she suspected was, beneath all its complications, genuine. She walked back to her wagon. She did not look back, but she was thinking. Hard. Issa. The 3 days passed in the particular way of days when a decision is being made, slowly on the surface, at tremendous speed underneath. Evelyn worked the ranch with her usual precision and said nothing to anyone beyond her father. She repaired fence on the first day, helped the hands move the breeding cattle on the second, and on the morning of the third she sat at her mother's kitchen table before dawn, with a lamp lit and her hands flat on the wood, and worked through the whole thing one final time. What was she afraid of? She was afraid of losing herself, of becoming an appendage to someone else's life after 50 years of being the center of her own. She was afraid that what Caleb Draven called a partnership would reveal itself, once she was bound to it legally and geographically, as something considerably more like ownership. She was afraid of the loneliness of a marriage that was built from necessity rather than feeling. She had watched women live that loneliness, had watched it hollow them out over decades, watched them become smaller and quieter and more transparent until they were barely there at all, ghosts in their own kitchens. She was afraid of him, in the particular way you were afraid of something unknown, not with evidence, but with the imagination's talent for worse cases. But she thought about what she'd seen when she looked at him, the ranch that bore the unmistakable mark of a man with genuine standards, the hands who moved with the competence of people who were well led, the straightforward language, the immediate agreements, the absolute absence of performance. She thought about what he'd said. I'm looking for a partner, not a possession. Maybe that was a lie. Maybe it was strategy. Tell the capable woman what she needs to hear, then reveal the actual terms once she's too far in to turn back. Maybe she was reading a desperate man's sales pitch as character. Or maybe he meant it. She had been reading people for 50 years. Her hit rate was not perfect. No one's was. But it was good. And what she had read in Caleb Draven's face, in the careful plainness of his speech, in the unhurried directness of his dark eyes, was not a man who was lying. Was a man who was lonely, who was building weary, who had assembled something magnificent and found the magnificence of it less sustaining than he'd expected. She could work with that. She could work with honest. She could not work with dishonest, but she could work with almost anything else. She stood up, straightened her dress, and went to find her father. I'm going to say yes, she told him. Thomas Mercer looked at his daughter for a long time. His eyes were wet, which she pretended not to notice because that was what dignity required in moments like this. You don't have to, he said. Papa. Her voice was very gentle, which was how you knew she meant something absolutely. Don't do that. Don't hand me back the choice when we both know what the choice costs. Evelyn, I am not a sacrifice. She said it firmly, clearly, with all 50 years of herself behind it. I want you to hear that. I'm not walking into this with my eyes closed or my hands tied. I looked at that man, I talked to that man, and I made my own assessment. And my assessment is that this is a better risk than you're giving it credit for." She paused. "It might even be more than a risk. I don't know yet, but I intend to find out." Thomas put his face in his hands. The kitchen was very quiet. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry I put you here." "You're going to stop saying that after today," she said, not unkindly. "Once? You get to say it once, and then we move, because that's what we do. We move." She put her hand on his shoulder, briefly, firmly, and then she went to write the letter. The wedding was set for 3 weeks out, which was time enough to satisfy the basic requirements of propriety, and not a day more. It was small, the kind of ceremony that people attended because they were invited and stayed because they were curious, not because there was joy in it that they wanted to share. The Reverend from Gray Bend performed it in the parlor of the Mercer Ranch House, which Evelyn had insisted upon, her ground, for the beginning of this thing, because she needed one solid choice that was unambiguously hers. Caleb Draven stood through the ceremony in a dark coat that was clean and well-fitted and clearly not worn often. He stood very still. He answered the required words in his quiet, even voice. He did not reach for her hand unless the ceremony required it. He did not look at her with anything she could read as hunger or acquisition. He looked at her with the same careful directness she had seen on his porch, the look of a man who was paying attention. She wore her mother's good dress, altered. She carried no flowers. She did not cry. Afterward, when the guests had eaten the modest food and offered their varied and mostly unconvincing congratulations, and finally departed, she stood in the yard of the ranch she had grown up on and looked at the barn, the fence lines, the garden that was her mother's, all of it golden in the late afternoon light. She breathed in the smell of it, hay, and turned earth and the clean, cold edge of the hills. Then she turned to where Caleb Draven stood, a few feet away, his coat jacket over his arm now, watching her with his quiet hawk's eyes. "Ready?" he said. The word was gentle. It asked the question honestly. She looked at him. This stranger she had just married, this man about whom she knew, in the practical terms of actual knowledge, almost nothing. "I'm not sure ready is the right word," she said. He considered this. "Fair enough," he said. They loaded her things into his wagon in the remaining light. Her father stood on the porch and watched, and she went to him one last time and embraced him, really embraced him, fiercely, with both arms. And she felt him hold on with the desperation of a man who understood that he was being forgiven for something unforgettable. "We'll come back on Sunday," she said, against his ear. "Start getting used to it." She climbed up onto the wagon seat beside Caleb Draven. He shook the reins gently, and the horse moved forward, and the Mercer Ranch fell away behind her, and the road to Black Creek stretched out ahead through the last of the spring light. She did not know what waited for her at the end of it. She did not know who this man beside her truly was beneath the legend and the long silence and the walls he'd built around himself out of decades of hard necessity. What she knew was simpler and perhaps more important. She was 50 years old. She had held things together through conditions that would have broken other people. She had bent in the wind, but never broken. She had sacrificed and worked and endured and survived. And she was not done yet, not even close to done. The wagon rolled forward through the spring evening. Beside her, Caleb Draven drove with both hands on the reins and did not speak. But his silence was not the silence of indifference. It was the silence of a man who understood that some things could not be rushed, and who had, perhaps, finally decided to stop pretending he didn't need them. The first stars appeared above the hills. Evelyn Mercer, Evelyn Draven now, though the name sat strangely, lifted her chin and watched them come out one by one, and breathed and thought. "All right then, let's see what you're made of." Whether she was talking to the man beside her or to herself, she couldn't entirely have said. Probably both. The road to Black Creek Ranch was 11 miles long, and by the time the wagon rolled through the main gate, Evelyn had used every one of those miles to build herself back up. That was what she did. She'd done it her whole life. When the ground shifted, when the thing you'd braced for turned out to be something else entirely, you didn't stand in the middle of the road and grieve the version of events you'd prepared for. You adjusted, you took in what was actually in front of you, and you worked with that instead. Sentimentality about your own expectations was a luxury the frontier didn't offer, and she had learned that lesson early enough that it had become reflex rather than discipline. Still, she had prepared herself for something specific, and what she found when the wagon came to a stop in the yard of Black Creek Ranch was not it. The yard was quiet at this hour. Full dark now, the stars bright overhead, a lamp burning in the bunkhouse, and another in what she would come to know was the foreman's quarters. A man she hadn't seen before came from the direction of the barn at the sound of the wagon, moving without urgency, but with the particular alertness of someone who kept unusual hours by habit. "Mr. Draven," the man said, and took the horse without being asked. He glanced at Evelyn once, a look that was professional rather than curious, the look of a man who had been told things would change and had decided in advance to let them. And then he led the horse away and left them standing in the yard. Caleb stepped down from the wagon and moved to her side to take the largest of her bags before she could reach for it. She let him, not because she needed the help, but because refusing it in that moment would have been a performance of independence for an audience that wasn't watching, and she was too practical for performances. "I'll show you the house," he said. She followed him up the 3 broad steps to the front door, and he held it open, and she walked in. The interior of the main house at Black Creek Ranch was, like its exterior, a study in plainness elevated by quality. The entry hall was wide, with a plank floor worn smooth by years of use, a rack for coats and hats near the door, a single lamp on a side table, no ornamentation for its own sake, no curtains chosen to impress. Everything present had a function, and everything with a function was well made. She moved through the hall and into the main room and looked around with the methodical eye of a woman cataloging what she was working with. The hearth was large, good, for a house this size in this climate. The furniture was solid, the kind of furniture that had been bought for durability rather than fashion, and had delivered on that promise. The kitchen she could see through the open doorway was a real working kitchen, not the kind dressed up for company. Blackened pots, a good iron range, a prep table that had seen genuine use. Above the mantel, a single-frame survey map of the Black Creek territory, hand-annotated in a neat spare hand she recognized from the note he'd sent her father. "Mrs. Aldrin looks after the house," Caleb said, setting down her bag near the staircase. "She's been here 12 years. She keeps her own hours and runs her own kitchen, and I've never interfered with that. She'll be here tomorrow morning." A pause. "She knows you're coming. I told her a week ago." "Did you tell her the circumstances?" He looked at her steadily. "I told her I was getting married. The circumstances are our business." She held his gaze for a moment. "All right." He carried her bag up the stairs without comment, and she followed. The landing at the top split into a hallway with 4 doors, 2 on each side. He opened the 3rd on the right. "This is yours," he said. She stepped inside. It was a corner room. The best room, she realized immediately, because the corner gave it 2 windows instead of 1, and those windows faced east and south, which meant morning light. It was not a small room. The bed was larger than the one she'd had at the ranch house, with a frame of solid dark wood and a quilt that was plain but clean. There was a writing desk under the south window, a washstand, a wardrobe with double doors, a braided rug on the floor in muted colors, and a small armchair near the east window, positioned to look out over the range, which was so precisely the placement she would have chosen herself that she stood looking at it for a moment with something she couldn't immediately categorize. "The bolt is on your side of the door," Caleb said from the doorway. He said it plainly, without emphasis, as a statement of fact. "My room is at the end of the hall. If you need anything in the night, there's a lamp on the landing that stays lit." She turned to look at him. He was standing in the doorway with his hand on the frame, not entering the room, and his expression was the same careful blankness it had been since the ceremony, controlled but not cold, neutral in the way of a man exerting a deliberate effort to take up no more space than he was invited to fill. She understood, in that moment, that this was going to cost him something, the restraint. She could see it clearly, the way she could see tension in a fence line before it snapped, not in anything he said or did, but in the precision of what he didn't say or do. He had built himself a rule, and he was holding to it by the same stubborn will that had built everything else, and she found she respected that in a way she hadn't anticipated. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. "Good night, Mrs. Draven." She almost flinched at the name. Almost. "Good night, Mr. Draven." He pulled the door closed. She listened to his footsteps move down the hall, unhurried even, fading. And then she was alone in the corner room with the east and south windows, and the bolt on her side of the door, and the armchair positioned exactly right. She sat down in the chair, still in her traveling clothes, and looked out at the dark shape of the range under the stars. She was 50 years old, and she had just moved into a stranger's house and bolted the door of her own room against a husband she did not know. She sat with all of that for a long moment. Then she unpacked her bag, washed her face at the basin, and went to bed. She slept better than she had in months. She didn't entirely know what to make of that. The woman who arrived in the kitchen the following morning was exactly what Evelyn had hoped for, and also, she would realize this gradually, one of the more important relationships of the next chapter of her life, though she didn't know that yet. Martha Aldrin was 60 years old, broad-shouldered, with iron gray hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, and the kind of face that had been plain to begin with and had become handsome through sheer force of character over the decades. She moved through her kitchen with the proprietary ease of someone who had long ago ceased to require anyone's permission to be competent. She looked at Evelyn when Evelyn came downstairs at 6:30 and said, "Coffee's hot. Eggs are on the side. How do you take yours?" "Black," Evelyn said, "and scrambled if there are enough." "There are always enough." Martha poured the coffee and set it down at the table with the manner of a woman who had made up her mind about something and wasn't troubled by it. "Mr. Draven's already out. He's up before light most days, back midday for the main meal, out again until supper." "That's his habit?" "Every day I've known him." Martha cracked eggs into the pan with practiced efficiency. "He works hard, always has. Doesn't ask anything of anyone he wouldn't do himself. That's what the men will tell you if you ask them, which they won't volunteer because he's also not a man who invites that kind of conversation." Evelyn wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "You like him?" Martha gave her a sideways look. "I respect him." "That's a different thing, and a better one, generally speaking." She slid the eggs onto a plate and set it down. "I'll tell you what I told myself when he said he was bringing a wife home. I said, if she's the kind of woman who's going to rearrange everything and make the place into something it isn't, that'll be a problem. And if she's the kind of woman who knows what she's looking at and works with it, that'll be fine." She sat down across from Evelyn with her own coffee and looked at her directly. "Which kind are you?" Evelyn ate a forkful of eggs. "The second kind." Martha nodded, once with the decisive finality of a judge. "Good," she said. "Then we'll get along." They did, almost immediately. The first week passed in observation, which was Evelyn's natural mode in any new situation. She did not attempt to assert herself precipitously, not because she lacked the confidence to do so, but because she understood that authority earned over time held better than authority claimed on arrival. She watched how Martha ran the household, learned the rhythms of the ranch day, introduced herself to the hands with the quiet, matter-of-fact manner that had always served her better than any performance of authority. The hands were cautious with her at first, not hostile, but watchful. They were men who knew their employer and had calibrated themselves to him over years, and a new variable in his household required assessment before trust was extended. She understood this and gave them time. She did not try to win them over. She simply did what she had always done. She worked, she was straight with people, and she let that be enough. Caleb himself was, in those first days, a presence more than a companion. He was in the house for meals, punctual, which she noted approvingly. And he ate with an appetite that testified to genuine physical labor. And he spoke when there was something worth saying and was silent when there wasn't. He asked her on the third morning whether the room was comfortable. "Yes," she said. "The east window is good." He nodded. "My mother always said morning light was worth more than an extra room." It was the first personal thing he had volunteered, and it landed in the quiet of the kitchen like a small stone dropped into water. And neither of them mentioned it again, but she stored it carefully. He'd had a mother, obviously. But he'd thought about her in the context of morning light, which meant he remembered things about her, which meant she'd mattered. People who'd had someone matter to them in that way carried the shape of it somewhere. On the fifth day, she found him in the barn in the late afternoon, working on a harness that needed restitching, and she stopped in the doorway because she'd come looking for Martha's opinion on something and found Caleb instead. And there was a moment before he heard her step where she watched him work unobserved. His hands were very sure. He stitched with the focused attention of a man who had been doing this for many years, who had probably done it by firelight and in bad weather and in circumstances where getting it wrong had consequences. There was something in the sight of it, the competence, the quietness, that moved something in her she didn't expect. She stepped fully into the barn. He looked up. "The gray mare's favoring her left foreleg," she said, because that was actually also true and gave the visit a purpose. "I noticed this morning." He set down the harness and stood. "She's been doing that since Tuesday. It's a stone bruise, but I had Jared look at it. She'll be off work for the week." "Did Jared pack it?" "He did." "Good." She paused. "You've got a skilled farrier in Jared." "Best I've ever had." He picked up the harness again, but he didn't sit. He stood holding it, looking at her with that steady, unhurried attention. "You know horses." "I know everything that keeps a ranch alive. Horses, cattle, fencing, water management, weather reading." She looked around the barn, its clean order, the quality of the tack, the well-maintained stalls. "So do you." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, she was beginning to understand that smiles were not his primary vocabulary, but something adjacent, an opening. "Martha says you've been helping her with the supply lists." "Martha knows her kitchen and her household perfectly well. I've been making suggestions on the garden. She's more open to it than she let on initially." "She's open to competence," he said. "She just makes you prove it first." "As she should." He looked at her for a moment longer. "Come see the South herd tomorrow morning," he said. "If you want. I'm taking Jared and 2 of the others to move them to the summer pasture. It's a long day's work, but the country's worth seeing." It was the longest personal invitation he had extended since the night she arrived. She recognized it for what it was, an offering of something he valued, given without performance or expectation. "What time?" she asked. "Before light." "I'll be ready." She was, and the country was, as he had said, worth seeing. That day on the range, moving cattle across high open land in the early morning, the sky going from black to deep blue to the particular burning gold of sunrise over the hills, was the first day she felt something shift between them from wary coexistence towards something that didn't yet have a name, but was definitely a different quality of air. They worked alongside each other without needing to talk much, which was its own kind of language. And when they did talk, it was about the cattle, the land, the condition of the water sources, the practical language of people who had both spent their lives in this work and could therefore speak it without translation. At noon, they stopped near a creek lined with cottonwoods and ate the food Martha had packed, and the hand settled a little distance away with the natural tact of people who understood when to give space, and Evelyn sat on a flat rock with her coffee from the thermos and felt, for the first time since the morning her father had come home with hollow eyes, something approaching peace. "You built all of this yourself," she said. Not a question. Caleb sat on the ground a few feet away, his hat pushed back, studying the middle distance. "From the beginning," he said. "How long?" "I came to this territory with 2 horses, enough money to buy a small herd, and nothing else. That was 23 years ago." He paused. "I slept in a lean-to the first 2 winters." She looked at the scope of what surrounded them. The pasture, the distant fence lines, the visible geometry of careful management that extended as far as she could see. "And you did this alone?" "Mostly." He was quiet for a moment. "Had one good partner in the early years, a man named Holt. He died of typhoid in '62. After that? Yes. Mostly alone." There it was again, that shape she had caught a glimpse of before, the outline of something under all the armor, the loneliness that had been running so long it had become structural. She didn't say anything about it. That was not the moment for it. But she filed it away with everything else she was learning, in the careful ongoing catalog of a woman who read people the way other people read land. "Your father settled things before you were born, I imagine," he said. "My grandfather settled. My father held." She looked at the hills. "I've mostly held. I wanted to build, but the years didn't cooperate." "The years rarely cooperate." "No," she agreed. They don't. The ride home that evening was long and quiet and not uncomfortable. She was tired in the deep, satisfying way of genuine physical work, and she sat her horse easily beside him on the trail back and let the silence be what it was, which was, she realized somewhere on the last stretch before the ranch lights came into view, not the silence of strangers, but something measurably warmer. The silence of people who had worked alongside each other and found the working honest. She still didn't know him, not truly, not in the ways that mattered. She had surfaces, his competence, his restraint, his particular brand of quiet, the way he treated his men, the way he'd looked at the cattle that morning with something that was close to affection for the land they stood on. She had that note he'd written her father, the careful handwriting, the lack of manipulation in it. She had the bolt on her side of the door, which had never been tested because it had never needed to be. She had the corner room with the east window and the armchair positioned exactly right, and she had not asked him whether he'd arranged that purposely, and he had not told her, and she thought about it sometimes in the mornings when the light came through and turned the room gold. 2 weeks into her time at Black Creek Ranch, she understood why Caleb Draven was feared. It announced itself not through anything she witnessed directly, but through a sequence of small interactions that assembled themselves, over several days, into a complete picture. It began with the supply run to Graybend. She went with Martha, who went to town every 2 weeks with a list, and a no-nonsense manner that most merchants had long since learned not to test. Evelyn went because she needed to establish herself in the town's understanding of Black Creek Ranch, and the sooner that happened, the better for everyone. She understood the mechanics of frontier social architecture. A woman who let herself be invisible in a community became invisible to it in every way, including ways that mattered. Graybend was the kind of town that had grown faster than its character could support. A main street with ambitions, side streets with realities, and the ever-present tension between the people who had been there long enough to have opinions and the money and trade that kept the whole thing alive. She had been in Graybend dozens of times in her life, knew most of the merchants, had her own small history with the place, but she had never navigated it as a Draven before. The difference was immediate and tangible. It was not the deference of warmth, it was the deference of apprehension. Conversation shifted when she introduced herself. Eyes went careful. The dry goods merchant, a man named Paulie, who she had known casually for years, helped her with a speed and thoroughness that bordered on anxious. A woman she had chatted comfortably with on previous visits found reasons to be elsewhere in the store. She absorbed all of this without comment. The real education came in the afternoon when she was waiting outside the mercantile for Martha to finish a conversation with the seamstress next door, and 2 men she didn't know settled against the railing of the building across the street, apparently having either forgotten or not noticed that she was within hearing range of their conversation. "Hear he married some rancher's daughter?" the first man said. "Widow's daughter, woman near 50 from what I'm told." The second man shook his head. "Can't imagine what she was thinking. Can't imagine she had much choice. Draven wanted something, I'm sure. Man always wants something. Ask the Hendersons, or what's left of them." A pause thick with meaning. "Or Garver Crane, except you can't, because Crane left the territory in the middle of the night 3 years ago and hasn't been seen since." "You think Draven?" "I think a man doesn't build what he's built without leaving bodies behind. Maybe not the kind you bury, but bodies." The first man made a sound of agreement. "Poor woman," he said, and it wasn't entirely clear whether he meant her specifically or women as a category, or simply everyone in proximity to Caleb Draven. They moved on. She stood very still for a moment, her hands at her sides, feeling the conversation settle over her like cold water. Then she picked up the parcel she'd been holding and went to find Martha. That night she sat in the armchair by the east window, with the lamp low, and worked through what she'd heard with the same methodical honesty she applied to everything. She had known there were stories. She had known before she married him that the territory held opinions about Caleb Draven that ranged from grudging respect to genuine fear. She had factored this into her assessment, or believed she had. But there was a difference between knowing abstractly that someone had a dark reputation and standing on a boardwalk hearing specific references made to specific people. The Hendersons, Garver Crane, men displaced or destroyed or fled in the middle of the night. Names. The specificity of names made it real in a way that general reputation did not. The question was what to do with it. She could go to him with it. She was not a woman who lacked the nerve for direct confrontation. She had confronted suppliers, bank managers, her own father, ranch hands twice her size who decided to test her authority. Confrontation was not something she feared, but she wanted more information first. She wanted to understand the shape of the thing she was confronting before she confronted it, because she'd learned over 50 years that walking into a conversation without full context was how you ended up asking the wrong questions. The opportunity came from an unexpected direction 2 days later in the form of the foreman. His name was Samuel Briggs. Sam to everyone on the ranch, a man of 52 who had been with Draven for 14 years and who had, in Evelyn's 2 weeks of observation, revealed himself to be a person of genuine quality. Fair with the hands, straight in his dealings, possessed of a dry humor that emerged in specific circumstances and made you feel like you'd been let in on something. He had not warmed to her immediately, but he had also not positioned himself against her, and she had registered this as a kind of neutral ground that could be worked with. She found him at the fence of the training corral on a Wednesday morning, watching a young hand work a horse, and she settled beside him on the rail with her coffee and made no immediate demand on his attention. They watched the horse together for a while. "He's pushing too hard on the turns," she said eventually. "He knows," Sam said. "He just needs to learn it in his body before he stops doing it." She nodded. Then, without preamble, "Tell me about the Hendersons." Sam's attention didn't visibly shift. He kept watching the horse, but she felt him make a decision. The particular stillness of someone determining how much truth to offer and of what variety. "The Hendersons were a cattle family," he said finally. "Father and 2 sons. Had land about 30 miles northeast of here. Good land, actually. They ran it badly. Overgrazed the north pastures, let the water sources go unmanaged, borrowed too much, and spent too little time on the actual work." A pause. "They also had a habit of letting their cattle drift south onto Black Creek Range and then claiming they couldn't account for it when asked. Caleb pressed them. He warned them 3 times. The 3rd time, he did it in front of witnesses and made it clear what would happen if the boundary wasn't respected." Sam watched the horse make a bad turn. The 4th time their cattle crossed the line, he sold them. By the time the Hendersons came to retrieve them, he'd already transferred the bill of sale. It was legal, it was cold, but it was after 3 warnings that any man would have respected if he'd been smart about it. And Garver Crane? This pause was longer. Crane was a different matter. He finally looked at her, directly, with the careful eyes of a man who'd decided she'd earned the real answer. Crane had a partnership with a man named Dills. They were running a scheme, buying up water rights along the creek tributaries that fed into this range, small pieces, legal purchases, nothing that would raise attention on its own. But the idea was to accumulate enough rights that they could effectively cut off water access to the whole northern section of Black Creek and then sell the rights back to Draven at whatever price they named. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "That's not just business. That would have destroyed the ranch." That was the intent. Crane had reasons, old ones. He and Draven had a history I don't know all of from before my time here. Sam looked back at the horse. "When Draven figured it out, and he figures things out, I'll tell you that much. He didn't go to Crane with threats. He went to every one of those water right sellers and he offered to buy the rights back at a premium, quietly, before Crane could consolidate them. He had it done in 10 days. Crane woke up one morning with the whole plan dismantled under him and nothing to show for it except money spent on rights he no longer owned. And then Crane left. Crane left. Whether he left because he was frightened or because he was embarrassed or because he understood that staying in the same territory as Caleb Draven after pulling that kind of move was inadvisable. I couldn't tell you the exact proportion of each. She absorbed this. The horse in the corral finally took a clean turn, and the young hand whooped, and Sam allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. "He's not a kind man by nature," Sam said then, quietly, unprompted. "He doesn't work at being liked, and he doesn't suffer foolishness, and he has a memory like a steel trap for anyone who's tried to do him harm. Those things are true." He looked at her. "But he's straight. He doesn't cheat. He doesn't take what isn't his, and he doesn't move on a man without warning him first. In this territory, in my experience, that puts him considerably above average." She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said. I didn't tell you anything. No, she agreed. You didn't. She went back to the house and sat in the kitchen with the second cup of coffee of the morning and thought about straight men who were not kind, about armor and loneliness and the particular damage that could be done by a life lived entirely in self-defense. She thought about the cold logic of a man who had learned early that the frontier did not reward sentiment and had never unlearned that lesson even after the lesson was no longer the only one available. She thought about his hands on that harness in the barn, the sure stitching, the focused quiet of it. She had decided, before she arrived at this ranch, that she would survive this marriage. That was the word she'd used to herself. Survive. Get through it, maintain herself, protect her sense of who she was, hold on to the essential Evelyn underneath whatever the circumstances tried to make of her. She was beginning to think that survival might not be the most useful framework she had available. That evening at supper, she waited until Martha had gone and the table had been cleared, and Caleb was drinking his coffee with the unhurried stillness that was his natural state, and she said, I heard something in Gray Bend on Thursday. He looked up. About? About you. She looked at him directly. About the Hendersons. About Garver Crane. About what people in town say when they think no one's listening. His expression didn't change. He didn't reach for reassurance or explanation. He simply set down his coffee and gave her his full attention, which was, she was learning, how he handled things he considered serious. And I went and found Sam Briggs and asked him to tell me the real version. He did. She paused. I'm not asking you to defend yourself. I'm telling you what I know so that we're starting from the same ground. I don't want to be a woman who has conversations behind her husband's back and builds opinions out of half information. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Sam told you about Crane? Yes. What do you think? She looked at him steadily. I think a man who dismantles a scheme in 10 days rather than retaliating directly is a man who thinks before he acts. I think the Hendersons got exactly what they earned after 3 warnings. I think the stories people tell about you in Gray Bend are true in the facts and wrong in the character. She paused. And I think you've let those stories run because you understood they were useful. Something shifted in his face then. Something significant. Something that moved below the surface like a deep current changing direction. He looked at her with those dark, still eyes, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something in them that wasn't carefully controlled. Yes, he said, simply and completely. I let them run. Why? He was quiet for longer this time. She waited because she had learned that he was a man who needed silence to arrive at honesty, not because he was hiding from it, but because he built things carefully, including words. When I started building this ranch, he said, I had nothing, no connections, no family name, no one with reason to help me. What I had was a reputation for not being someone to cross lightly. That reputation opened doors that my circumstances should have kept closed. It kept men from testing me who would have tested me otherwise. He looked at his hands on the table. The frontier was not generous in those years. It rewarded strength and punished everything that looked like weakness. I learned that fast enough, and I used what was available to me. He looked up. At some point, the legend outgrew what made it necessary, but by then it was doing its job so well I couldn't see the reason to correct it. You traded your reputation for safety, she said, and then you couldn't get it back. Something like that. People are afraid of you. Yes. Does that bother you? He looked at her for a long time, and in the quality of that look, the long-held stillness of it, the thing behind his eyes that was old and tired and had been carrying weight for too long alone, she got her answer more clearly than any words he might have given her. Go to bed, Mr. Draven, she said gently, not dismissively, with a gentleness that was itself a kind of acknowledgement that said, I see this and I'm not running from it, and we can put it down for tonight. He blinked, as if the gentleness surprised him more than confrontation would have, which told her something important about the kind of people who had been in his life. Good night, Mrs. Draven, he said. She went upstairs. She unbolted the door, as she did every night, and then locked it again from the inside, and she sat in the armchair and looked at the dark range beyond the east window and breathed slowly. She was not afraid of him. She had examined that carefully, honestly, with all the precision she could bring to bear, and it was true. She was not afraid. She had been afraid of the idea of him before she knew him, which was a different thing entirely. What she felt, sitting in that armchair in the dark, was something that had no clean name yet. It was warmer than pity and more complicated than respect, and carried none of the lightness of liking but something denser and more durable. It was the feeling of recognizing a thing for what it truly was, not what it advertised, not what legend had made of it, but the actual substance underneath. Caleb Draven had built walls so high and so thick that most people had stopped trying to see over them years ago. He had built them for good reasons, initially, and then he had kept building because building was the only thing he knew how to do when something needed protecting, and the thing inside the walls had been so long without company that he had possibly forgotten what company felt like. She was not a woman who wept easily, but she felt something ache in her chest that night for the long loneliness of him, for the particular damage of a life spent being exactly what the world required rather than what you were. She understood that ache. She had her own version of it, 50 years of being the capable one, the reliable one, the one who held things together, the one nobody worried about because she could manage. Nobody had asked, in a very long time, whether she was all right. Nobody had thought to ask, because she was always all right, because she made herself always all right, because someone had to be. Two people in the same house, she thought, both of them very good at surviving, neither of them especially practiced at anything else. She stayed in the armchair until she was tired enough for sleep, and then she went to bed, and the ranch settled around her in the dark. The low sounds of animals, the creak of the house against the night wind, the particular deep quiet of land that had been well cared for, and she felt it receive her the way good land received whoever was willing to take it seriously. It didn't feel like a prison. It had never, she realized, felt like a prison. It felt like something waiting, patient and enormous, and full of the kind of possibility that only revealed itself to people who stayed long enough to see it. She turned on her side and closed her eyes. Outside, the spring night moved across the high plateau, and the stars above Black Creek Ranch burned the way they always burned over land that had no pretensions, fiercely, without apology, and without the slightest interest in what anyone thought about them. June came to Black Creek Ranch the way it always came to high country, sudden and absolute, like a decision finally made after long deliberation. One morning you woke and the cold was simply gone, replaced overnight by a warmth that carried the smell of grass and distance and the particular quality of light that made everything look like it was being seen for the first time. The cottonwoods along the creek went green all at once. The cattle moved differently in the heat, slower and more deliberate, and the hands shed their heavy coats and went about their work in shirt sleeves, and the whole ranch seemed to exhale something it had been holding since winter. Evelyn noticed all of it. She noticed everything, still. It was a habit too deep to lose, the constant inventory of a woman who had learned that the details were where the truth lived. But she noticed it differently now than she had in those first careful weeks. She noticed it with the ease of someone who had begun, quietly and without ceremony, to belong somewhere. She had not expected that. She had prepared herself for endurance and found herself instead in the early, tentative stages of something that felt dangerously like home. The ranch had absorbed her the way good soil absorbed rain, gradually, completely, without drama. Martha had stopped treating her like a guest somewhere around the third week and begun treating her like a colleague, which was the highest compliment Martha's emotional vocabulary contained. The hands had warmed to her incrementally, in the specific way of men who tested through observation rather than conversation. She had fixed a broken pump housing one afternoon without asking for help, and she had read the weather correctly when everyone else missed the signs of an incoming squall and gotten the hay in 2 hours before the storm hit. And after that, the quality of their morning greetings had shifted in a way she recognized and valued. And Caleb. Caleb was a study in gradual revelation. He was still spare with words. He was still a man whose default expression communicated nothing in particular and whose silences were longer than most people were comfortable with. He was still capable of a coldness when dealing with business matters that was not cruelty but was absolute. She had sat in on one conversation with a cattle broker from the Eastern Territory who had tried to renegotiate a contract he'd already signed, and she had watched Caleb dismantle the man's argument with a quiet, surgical precision that left the broker with no ground to stand on and a very clear understanding of what happened when people tested Caleb Draven's patience. It had been, in a purely technical sense, impressive. She had said so afterward. "You didn't enjoy that," she said when the broker's wagon was retreating down the road. Caleb looked at her. "No. But you were good at it." Being good at something and enjoying it are different things. "Most people confuse them," she said. He had looked at her for a moment with that particular stillness, and then he had gone back into the house, and she had stood on the porch and let the observation settle into the growing architecture of what she knew about him. What she knew, by early June, was considerable. She knew he woke before light every day without exception, and that the first hour of his morning was spent alone, drinking coffee at the kitchen table before Martha arrived, in a silence that was not lonely but contemplative. She had come down early twice and found him there, and he had not seemed bothered by her presence, had simply poured her a cup without being asked, and returned to looking at whatever he was looking at in the middle distance. She knew he kept meticulous ledgers. She had seen them, at his invitation, when they discussed the ranch's financial structure, and that the handwriting in them was the same spare, precise script as the note he'd sent her father, every entry exact and clear. She knew he had not raised his voice in the 5 weeks she had lived under his roof. Not once, not even in the moments that would have justified it, and that this restraint was not suppression, but something more like choice. A man who had decided, at some point, that volume was a poor substitute for clarity. She knew he watched her, not in the way she'd initially braced for, not with ownership or assessment, or the calculating attention of a man taking stock of what he'd acquired. He watched her the way she watched him, with genuine curiosity, with the attention of someone who found the subject interesting and was trying to understand it fully. She had caught him at it several times, and each time he hadn't looked away or pretended he hadn't been doing it. He had simply met her gaze directly, which she found both disconcerting and oddly respectful. She knew, too, and this knowledge had come slowly, assembled from 100 small evidences, that he was lonely in a way so habitual he had probably stopped registering it as a distinct feeling, the way you stopped registering the weight of something you'd carried long enough. It had become part of his baseline, part of the weather of himself. And she thought sometimes, in the evenings when they sat on the south porch in the cooling air, and she worked on mending or correspondence while he read, because he was a reader, which had surprised her and then hadn't, she thought sometimes that the simple fact of her presence in that silence was doing something for him that neither of them had found a way to name yet. It was during one of those evenings, in the first week of June, that she told him she was going back to Gray Bend. "I need to see my father," she said. It was a Sunday, the light going amber in the west, and she had been turning the plan over for 2 days. "And there are some things I need to see to in town. I want to speak with the merchant about the fall supply orders, and Martha needs fabric from the seamstress." "Take the good wagon," he said without looking up from his book. "The road's rough after the creek crossing, and the spring thaws made it worse." "I know the road." "Take the good wagon anyway." She almost smiled. "All right." He turned a page. Then, without particular inflection, "If you want company on the ride, I can send one of the hands." "I'm 50 years old, Mr. Draven. I've been going to Gray Bend alone since I was 17. "I know." He finally looked up. "I'm offering, not insisting." "I know," she said, with the same even tone. "And I appreciate it. But I'll go alone." He looked at her for a moment with something she was beginning to recognize as the specific expression he wore when he was deciding whether to say the thing that was actually on his mind or the thing that was easier. The deciding expression. After a moment, he said, "People will talk to you differently now that you're here." "They already did, last time I went." "Last time was early. They were still deciding what to make of it. By now they've decided." "And their decision is?" He was quiet for a moment. "Some of them will be kind. Some will be careful with you in a way that looks like kindness but isn't. And some of them will try to tell you things about me that they believe are true, and some of which are." He looked back at his book, though she wasn't sure he was reading it. "I'm not asking you to ignore what you hear. I'm just—" A pause that was almost awkward, which was so unlike him that it registered as significant. "I wanted you to know that I'm aware of what they say. I'm not asking you to defend me. She looked at him for a long time. "I know you're not," she said finally. In the morning, she took the good wagon and drove the 11 miles to Gray Bend. Her father was thinner than she remembered from the wedding. Not alarming, just noticeable. The thinning of a man who was no longer carrying the physical weight of constant worry, but who hadn't entirely replaced it with anything yet. He was sitting on the porch when she pulled in, and he came down the steps with a speed that told her he'd been watching the road, which moved her more than she showed. "You look well," he said when he'd hugged her and stepped back to study her face with the particular parental scrutiny that never entirely faded no matter how old the child grew. "I am well," she said, and meant it, which still surprised her slightly. They sat at the kitchen table of the house she'd grown up in and drank coffee and talked for 2 hours with the ease of people who had always been honest with each other, even when honesty was hard. She told him what she had found at Black Creek, the order of it, Martha, the hands, the quality of the land. She told him about the cattle drive to the summer pasture, the broken pump, the way the work had folded her in. She told him carefully and completely, and she watched him listen, and she watched the guilt in his face compete with relief, and she let him work through both without trying to manage it for him. "And Draven himself?" he asked. "Is more complicated than his reputation," she said, "and more decent than the territory gives him credit for." Thomas Mercer looked at his daughter for a long time. Are you all right, Evelyn? Truly." "I am," she said. "Truly. It's not what I expected. It's not easy, in the ways that things between people are never easy. But it's honest, and I can work with honest." Her father nodded slowly, carefully, like a man handling something fragile. "He's treating you well." "He is." The hands respect me, as of about 3 weeks ago. She allowed herself a small smile. It took a broken pump and a correctly predicted storm. Thomas made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but close. "That's you," he said. "That's always been you." She left him in better spirits than she'd found him, and she stopped at the dry goods store and the seamstresses and made her arrangements with the matter-of-fact efficiency that was her natural mode in commerce, and by early afternoon she had finished her business and was considering the road home when she found herself, by a route she hadn't entirely planned, standing outside the Gray Bend Territorial Land Office. She had been thinking for several days about water, specifically about the water rights situation that Sam had described, the scheme Garver Crane had attempted, the vulnerability it had exposed, the fact that water access on the northern range of Black Creek had been the target because it was the most defensible point of attack. She had looked at the ranch's survey maps with Caleb 2 weeks prior when he was walking her through the property layout, and she had seen what she suspected he had also seen: 3 tributary rights on the northwest corner that were still unregistered to any specific owner. Small ones, not strategically critical on their own. But she'd been thinking about them. She went inside and spent 40 minutes with the land clerk, a mild young man named Proctor, who was initially uncertain how to handle a woman conducting this kind of business alone, and became considerably more certain after Evelyn established, with brisk courtesy, that she was entirely clear on what she was asking for and why. She left with the documentation to initiate registration on 2 of the 3 tributary rights in the name of Black Creek Ranch, which she would need Caleb to finalize, but which she had laid the groundwork for. It was as she was descending the steps of the land office, paperwork in hand, that she heard her name. "Mrs. Draven." She turned. The man standing on the boardwalk was perhaps 60 years old, heavy-set, with the particular well-fed look of a man whose prosperity had been bought at someone else's expense. His clothes were good quality and slightly too fine for a Tuesday afternoon in Gray Bend. He had a broad, smooth face that wore an expression of affable interest so rehearsed it had become automatic, and small eyes that were doing different work than the rest of his face. She placed him immediately, from her father's description. Aldous Burke. "Mrs. Draven," he said again, tipping his hat with a flourish that managed to be both polite and slightly mocking. "I heard you were in town. I'm Aldous Burke. I believe you've heard of me." "I have," she said. She kept her voice pleasant and her body still, the way you kept still around a dog you hadn't assessed yet. "Mr. Burke, I wanted to extend my congratulations on your recent marriage." He said it with the warm tone of a man delivering sincerity, which his eyes completely failed to support. "Your husband is a remarkable man. Most remarkable." "He is," she agreed. "We go back a ways, Caleb and I. Not friends, exactly." A small chuckle, inviting her to find him charming, "but we understand each other. Men in our positions generally do." "And what position is that?" she asked. He smiled. "Men who know how things work," he said. "How the territory works, how business works, how—" A slight pause, delicate as a knife between ribs. "Arrangements work." She looked at him steadily. She understood exactly what was happening. This was a performance designed to do several things simultaneously. Establish that he was not diminished by what had happened with her father's debt, signal that he viewed her marriage as an arrangement rather than a real one, and plant a seed of doubt in her mind about the nature of the world she'd married into. It was skillful in its way. It was the work of a man who was very good at finding the soft places in people. She had no soft places he could find, or at least not that kind. "My father's debt is settled in full," she said, in the tone of someone noting a fact of no particular emotional content. "I understand you are fairly compensated." Something moved behind his eyes. Reassessment. "Entirely fairly," he said, still smooth. "Good. Then we have nothing to discuss." She smiled at him with the same pleasantness he'd offered her, equally hollow, equally precise. "Good afternoon, Mr. Burke." She walked to her wagon without hurrying. She felt his eyes on her back the whole way, and she did not alter her pace by a single step. She thought about him the whole drive home, but not with fear, with the particular cold clarity she brought to things that needed to be understood. Burke was not finished with the territory. She was certain of that. Men like Burke were never finished. They regrouped, they reframed, they found new angles. The debt her father had carried had been just one instrument. There would be others. This was information. She stored it carefully, as she stored everything, and drove the good wagon home through the late afternoon light. And when she came through the gate of Black Creek Ranch and saw Caleb standing in the yard talking to Sam, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. She felt relieved to be back. She parked the wagon and climbed down, and Sam took it without being asked, and she carried Martha's fabric toward the house, and Caleb fell into step beside her without comment. "Good trip," he said. "Productive. I'll tell you about it over supper." She paused. "I ran into Aldous Burke." His step didn't change. His expression didn't change. But she felt something shift in the quality of his stillness, a density in it that hadn't been there a moment before. "And?" he said. "And nothing. He tried to be charming. It didn't work." She glanced at him. "He wanted me to know he considers our marriage an arrangement." "He would," Caleb said. Flatly, without visible feeling, which she was beginning to understand was how he handled things that actually did have feeling attached to them. "Also, I started the paperwork on the 2 Northwest tributary rights that are still unregistered. The proctor boy at the land office has the initial documents. You'll need to go in and finalize." She held out the papers she'd brought back. "I should have asked you first, but I was already there." He took the papers. He looked at them, then at her, and the look on his face was one she hadn't seen before. A complex thing, too layered to read cleanly, but somewhere in it was something that was very close to being moved. "I saw the gap on the survey map 2 weeks ago," he said. "I know, so did I." A pause. "You went to the land office for me." "I went for the ranch," she said, which was true, and also not the whole truth. And she thought they both knew that. She walked inside before either of them had to say anything else about it. At supper that night, she told him about Burke, in full. The boardwalk conversation, the calculated warmth of it, the thing behind his eyes. Caleb listened with the focused stillness of a man hearing something he'd known in principle and was now receiving in confirmed detail. Martha had cleared the dishes and gone to her own quarters, and the kitchen was quiet. In the good way, it was quiet on the evenings when the day's work had been real and the night ahead felt earned. "You weren't frightened of him," Caleb said. It was not quite a question. "No, I was clear about him. That's different." She looked across the table. "Has he moved against the ranch directly before?" He tried once, 4 years ago. A boundary survey dispute that he manufactured had a surveyor make a small error on official documentation that would have moved the southwest property line 40 feet in his favor, 40 feet that happened to include the best water access on that side. How did you catch it? I surveyed the property myself when I built it, and I know every foot of it. I went to the county surveyor's office and challenged the documentation, and it fell apart under examination. His hands were flat on the table, which she had come to recognize as the position they moved to when he was working through something that had weight. Burke is patient. He doesn't move directly. He looks for angles, and he waits until the angle is clean. Then we don't give him clean angles. He looked at her. We, he said, quietly. She returned his gaze. We, she confirmed, just as quietly. It was a small word. It sat between them on the kitchen table in the lamplight like something that had been placed there carefully, deliberately, by both of them at once. Caleb looked at his hands, then he looked at her, and she thought, she was quite certain, that she saw something shift in the deep water of his eyes, something that had been settled very still for a very long time, disturbed at last by something that had touched the surface. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. He was quiet for longer than usual. The lamp between them made warm light and soft shadows, and somewhere outside a nightbird called once and fell silent, and the house held its breath. The story about Garver Crane, he said. Sam told you the facts of it. They're accurate. But there's a part he doesn't know because I've never told anyone. She kept very still. Crane and I came up together, he said. In the early years, before Black Creek was anything. We weren't partners. I learned early not to take partners after Holt, but we were adjacent. We helped each other when it cost nothing, and we stayed out of each other's way when it did. There was a time when I might have called him a friend, if I'd been a man who used that word easily. He paused. She did not fill the pause. In the winter of '68, I had a bad season. Worse than bad. Lost nearly a third of the herd to a combination of disease and a freeze that came 2 weeks earlier than anyone predicted. I was close to finished. Not quite, but close. I went to Crane and asked him for a loan. Not large, but enough to cover the operating costs through spring. He stopped. He refused, she said. He refused. And then 3 weeks later, he registered a water claim on a tributary that fed 2 of my best summer pastures. A claim he'd been sitting on, waiting to file at the moment when I was most vulnerable and least able to fight it. He said this without emotion, which was its own kind of emotion. He didn't need the water. He had plenty of his own. He was moving on me because he'd calculated that I was close enough to the edge that he could push me over. She breathed slowly. But you survived the winter. I sold everything I could sell. I ate once a day for 3 months. I did the work of 4 men because I couldn't afford to pay anyone. His jaw was set in the way she recognized as the physical record of a decision made long ago and never revisited. And when spring came and I was still standing, I filed a counterclaim on the tributary that had more legal merit than his, and I fought him for it through the summer. And I won. And Crane? Crane and I never spoke again. For years, we simply didn't exist to each other. He looked at his hands. When he tried the water rights scheme 4 years ago, the one Sam told you about, I didn't think of it as business. I thought of it as a man who had already tried once to break me when I was down, trying again when he thought I might be less careful. So when you dismantled it, she said carefully, and he fled. I wanted him gone, Caleb said, and the flatness of it was absolute and entirely honest. Not because I wanted revenge, because a man who will move on you when you're down will keep moving on you until you make it not worth his while. I made it not worth his while. He left. And I let the story people told about it be the story that was most useful to me. The silence after this was different from the silences they usually shared. It was heavier. It carried the weight of something genuinely confessed. Evelyn looked at the man across the table. This weathered, armored, unexpectedly honest man who had just told her the truest thing he'd told anyone in what she suspected was a very long time. And she made a decision. I had a husband before, she said. He looked up because she had never volunteered this before, and he understood it for what it was. Robert Wyatt, she said. We married when I was 19. He died 14 months later, fever. She looked at the lamp. We were too young, and we barely knew each other, and when he died, I grieved it. But what I grieved most, I realized later, was the idea of what it might have been rather than the thing it actually was. Because we never got close enough to find out what it actually was. She looked at him directly. I spent 30 years after that becoming the kind of woman who didn't need anyone to depend on. Not because I didn't want connection or closeness or whatever word fits, but because it was easier to be sufficient than to be vulnerable. And I was good at sufficient. She paused. I think you understand that. He held her gaze for a long time. Yes, he said. I do. I'm telling you because I don't want us to be two people who are politely sufficient with each other for the rest of our lives. She said it plainly, without drama. I'm willing to be honest if you are. That's what I'm offering. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to have its own weather. Then, I'm not practiced at it. Neither am I. But I'm willing to try. Something in his face changed then. Something deep and structural, like a wall that hadn't been tested in years, discovering that it could, if it chose, let something through. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But the offer was there, visible in the set of his shoulders and the quality of his gaze. All right, he said. They sat with that for a while. The lamp burned between them. The night outside was full of its own sounds. The ranch, the range, the creek moving somewhere in the dark. All of it going on with the same indifferent momentum it had always had, while the two people in this kitchen arrived, quietly and at the same moment, at something new. What happened next unfolded over the following 3 weeks in the way of things that have been moving toward each other all along and finally reached the point where forward momentum is simply easier than resistance. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment of revelation. It was quieter than that and more durable for being quiet. It was the conversations that began after supper and lasted until the lamp ran low. It was the morning she came downstairs and found him at the kitchen table with her survey notes from the Northwest pasture open in front of him, not because he'd been asked to look at them, but because he was genuinely interested in what she'd been thinking. It was the afternoon she caught her thumb badly on a wire staple, and he bandaged it with a focus and gentleness that was so startlingly at odds with the public version of Caleb Draven that she had to look away. Not because it embarrassed her, but because it made her feel something she wasn't ready to be seen feeling yet. It was the evening he brought 2 horses around to the south side of the house without announcing his intention, and she came out and saw them saddled and waiting, and he said only, "The East Range looks good this time of year," and she had mounted without needing further invitation. They rode for 2 hours in the long summer evening, the light going gold, and then amber, and then that particular deep rose that came just before dark. They rode across land he had built from nothing, and that she had, in 8 weeks, come to know as well as her own hands. They didn't talk much. The horses moved easily, the range spread out in every direction, enormous and quiet and full of the settled authority of land that was well cared for. "You love this," she said at one point, not accusing, just naming what she saw. "Yes," he said, simply and without embarrassment, which was its own kind of progress. "So do I," she said. He looked at her then, the hawk's look, the deep-water gaze, and she looked back, and they held that for a moment that was long enough to matter, riding at a walk through the amber evening while the world went quietly about its business around them. There was a thing between them now that had not been there in the beginning. She could feel it the way you felt a change in atmospheric pressure before weather, not yet visible, but real, not yet named, but present. She was not a woman who moved toward romantic imagination. She had been too practical too long, had kept that side of herself too carefully tended down to keep from being used against her. But she was also honest, and honesty required her to acknowledge that what she felt when she was in a room with Caleb Draven had evolved considerably from the wary assessment of those first days. It was the Sunday evening in late June when the thing between them came into clearer focus, and it happened not through anything either of them planned, but through the particular chemistry of accumulated honesty and a long, rain-darkened afternoon. The storm came in from the northwest mid-afternoon, a real one, the kind that turned the sky a specific green-gray and made the horses restless an hour before the first crack of lightning. Evelyn had seen it coming from the south porch and had started making preparations before anyone else registered the threat. and the hands had scrambled to cover the hay and bring in the livestock and batten down everything that could be battened. And when the sky broke open at 4 o'clock, the ranch was as ready as it was going to be. She came in from the yard soaked to the skin, her hair down from its pins, and she stood in the entryway pulling off her wet jacket, and she was not thinking about how she looked or what impression she was making. She was thinking about whether the southwest drainage was adequate for this volume of water. Caleb came in behind her, equally wet, having spent the last 40 minutes in the barn making sure the horses were settled. He stopped a few feet away and they looked at each other, both of them dripping, and something about the shared discomfort of it, the undeniable physical reality of two people who had just worked hard together in bad conditions, collapsed a layer of distance that had been maintained through the previous weeks with the polite effort of two well-intentioned people trying to be careful with each other. "The southwest drainage," she started. "Is adequate," he said. "I deepened it 2 summers ago." "Good." She pushed her wet hair back from her face. He was looking at her the way he sometimes looked at the range, with the full attention of a man who was genuinely present in the moment, genuinely engaged with what was in front of him, not with the managed distance of his public manner, but with something unguarded and direct and very still. "You saw it coming," he said, "before Jared did. I've been reading this guy for weeks. You learn the patterns. You learn things fast. I pay attention." She looked at him. "So do you." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm threw rain against the windows in sheets, and the house held steady around them the way well-built things did, and the lamp on the entryway table made the same warm light it always made. "I don't know how to do this," he said then, quietly, with a directness that cost him something. She could hear it in the slight roughness of his voice. "Whatever this is, between us, I don't know how to. I've been alone a long time. I know how to run a ranch. I know how to protect what's mine. I don't know." He stopped. She looked at him for a long moment. This was the most unguarded she had seen him. The walls were not down. They had been too long in building for that. But there was a door open in them, and he was standing in it, and he had opened it himself. That mattered. "You're doing it right now," she said, saying the honest thing. "That's how." He looked at her. "I don't know how to do it either," she said. "I've been sufficient for 30 years. I'm very good at it, and I am tired of it." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking for anything except what we said at the kitchen table 3 weeks ago. Honesty. I can work with that. I have been working with it. So have you." He breathed. The rain hammered the windows somewhere in the house. The fire in the hearth sent its warmth through the rooms, and the smell of wet wool and wood smoke and the particular aliveness of a real storm existed all around them. "You're not what I expected," he said. "No," she agreed. "Neither are you." His expression, the careful, controlled, deep-water face of Caleb Draven, opened then, fractionally but genuinely, in a way that she suspected very few people had ever seen. Not a smile, exactly, but something that was warming toward one. Something that was moving, with the slow certainty of deep water finally reaching a change in the current, towards something it had been pointed at for a long time. She turned and went to find dry clothes because that was what the moment called for, and she was still, at her core, a practical woman. But she carried something up those stairs with her that she hadn't been carrying when she came down them that morning. Something warmer than resolve, something quieter than happiness. Something that felt, with great caution and great precision, like the early intimation of genuine feeling. The storm ran its course through the evening, and the ranch sat solid underneath it, and the lights burned in the windows of the main house against the dark. And inside, two careful, capable, long solitary people navigated the strange new geography of allowing themselves to be known. The storm that had broken over Black Creek Ranch that Sunday evening in late June did not simply pass. It settled. It ran through the night and into the following morning, a long, steady rain that was gentler than the initial violence of it but more thorough, soaking the ground to its roots, filling the creek to its banks, laying the dust of the summer range flat, and releasing the smell of earth that had been waiting under the dry surface for exactly this. Evelyn woke at first light to the sound of it still falling and lay in the corner room with the east window running with water, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. The particular stillness of a woman who has nowhere urgent to be and nothing pressing to defend and can simply exist inside a moment without immediately converting it into something productive. She lay there for 20 minutes. For her, that was extraordinary. When she came downstairs, Caleb was at the kitchen table with his coffee and his ledgers, which was his usual morning configuration, except that he looked up when she came in and said good morning, in a voice that was the same quiet voice it always was, and yet she felt the difference in it, a warmth that had not been there 3 weeks ago, a faint but genuine ease, like a room that has been aired out and lets in light it wasn't letting in before. "Coffee's fresh," he said. "Thank you." She poured herself a cup and stood at the window looking out at the rain. The South Range was gray and silver in the wet morning, the grass brilliant green, the fence lines dark with moisture. A beautiful country, even in bad weather. Especially in bad weather, maybe. The scale of it became more apparent when weather moved across it, the way you understood the size of an ocean when you saw a storm moving over it from a distance. "I was thinking about Burke," she said, because that was what she had been thinking about when she woke up, and she saw no reason to disguise it. She heard him set down his pen. "Tell me." "He'll move again." "You said so. I think the question is when and from which direction." She turned from the window. "The water rights paperwork you filed 2 weeks ago, that closes one angle. But the southwest property, the section that borders the county road, who holds the land on the far side of that road?" He was looking at her with the full attention she had come to depend on. "A man named Fraser, Ellis Fraser. He's been ranching that section for 8 years. Small operation, mostly horses. He's not a problem." "Does he have debt?" A pause. She watched him follow her thinking. "I don't know," he said. "I could find out. Because if Burke is patient, which he is, and if his method is to acquire pressure points rather than move directly, which it is, then a man with adjacent land and manageable debt is exactly the kind of instrument he'd use. Not to come at you head on, to come at you from the side through someone else's financial trouble, the way he came at my father." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain fell in long, even sheets. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since I met him on that boardwalk," she said. "I didn't like the look behind his eyes. There's no satisfaction in it, no pleasure in the conversation, no real interest in me. He was filing information, cataloging, thinking about what he could use." "That's an accurate reading." "Then let's not wait for him to be ready." She sat down at the table across from him. "You know this territory better than he does. You know who's struggling and who isn't, who has debt and who's managing. You built those relationships, or at least the professional versions of them, over 20 years. Use them. Not to move against anyone, to make sure the angles that exist are closed before he can find them." He looked at her with the long, considering gaze that she had learned to read as genuine engagement rather than silence. Then he said, "Are you always like this?" "Like what?" "3 steps ahead." She looked at him steadily. "I've been managing a failing ranch for 15 years without enough money and with too much responsibility." "Yes." "I'm always 3 steps ahead. It's the only way I know how to stay upright." He picked up his pen. Not to write, just to hold, which was a habit of his when he was thinking, she had noticed, the same way she pressed her thumbnail against her forefinger when she was working something through. "Fraser," he said, "I'll ride over this week." "Not to pressure him," she said quickly. He looked up with something that was nearly amusement in it. "I know, to know the situation. There's a difference." "There is," she agreed, "as long as you know which one you're doing." "Evelyn." He said her name, her first name, which he had not used before, not once, and the sound of it in his voice landed somewhere in her chest with an authority she hadn't braced for. "I know." She held his gaze. The fire in the hearth put warmth in the room. The rain continued its long conversation with the roof. "All right," she said, "then we're agreed." The we had become a natural thing between them. She noticed when it crossed a threshold from deliberate to habitual, somewhere in the first days of July. She heard herself use it with Sam one morning when discussing the plans for the North Pasture rotation, and she heard the ease of it, the complete absence of self-consciousness, and she recognized that as a kind of marker. Something had shifted. Not declared, not performed. Simply true. July at Black Creek Ranch was the fullest month Evelyn had experienced in years. The ranch was in its peak operational season. The summer pasture cattle needed attention. The haying had to be managed with precision. There were 2 significant cattle sales in the territory that required preparation and presence. She moved through all of it with the natural authority of a woman who had been doing this work her whole life and who had, in 3 months, absorbed the specific rhythms and requirements of this particular operation with a thoroughness that had ceased to surprise anyone, including herself. What had surprised her, what continued to surprise her, in the quiet way of genuinely unexpected things, was Caleb. Not the Caleb of reputation, or distance, or careful management. The Caleb of early mornings and late evening conversations. The Caleb who had turned out to have opinions about irrigation engineering that were both technically sophisticated and delivered with the focused passion of a man who had spent 20 years thinking hard about a problem. The Caleb who had told her, one evening when they were reviewing the summer accounts, that he had taught himself to read properly at 19 from a single shelf of books belonging to a mining camp foreman, and that the habit of it had stayed with him like weather, bone deep and permanent. She had looked at him when he said this and thought about the boy who had been him. No family money, no position, starting from nothing in a territory that had no mercy for starting from nothing, and she felt something that was not quite admiration and not quite tenderness but occupied the territory between them. "What was the first book?" she asked. He thought about it. "A surveying manual," he said, "which tells you everything about where my priorities were at 19. She laughed. It was a real laugh. She didn't produce many of those. They came from somewhere too genuine to be performed, and it seemed to surprise both of them. He looked at her with the expression she had come to associate with the moments when her reality slightly outpaced his expectation, and then he did the thing she had seen building toward for weeks. He smiled. Not the ghost of one, not the controlled almost movement she had caught occasionally and stored carefully. A real smile, quiet and warm and entirely unguarded, and it changed his face so completely that for a moment she felt like she was seeing him for the first time. She looked away first, because the directness of it was more than she was ready for in that moment, and she returned to the accounts with her practical face intact, but her heart was doing something irregular in her chest, and she let it do that privately, behind the reliable armor of composure. That was the first week of July. By the second week, she had stopped pretending, even to herself, that what she felt for Caleb Draven was primarily respect or practical partnership or the warmed-over gratitude of a woman who had expected cruelty and received decency instead. It was more than that. It had become more than that somewhere in the accumulated weight of all those evenings, all those honest conversations, all those moments of working alongside each other in the particular communion of shared purpose that she had not realized how much she'd missed until she had it. She did not say this. She was not a woman who spoke feelings before she was certain of them, and she was not entirely certain yet. Not of herself and not of him, not of what this was on his side of the table, not of whether what she read in his face on certain evenings was what she thought it was or what she hoped it was. And she was too old and too careful to confuse the two. But she knew what she was feeling, and it was not nothing. The Fraser situation came to a head in the third week of July, and it came faster than any of them had anticipated. Caleb had ridden to Ellis Fraser's property the previous week, as he'd said he would, in the easy, unofficial manner of one neighboring rancher checking in on another, which was a mode Evelyn suspected he didn't use naturally but had made a deliberate effort toward. He had come back with the information. Fraser had a note due at the end of summer held by the Graybend Bank, which was not in itself alarming. What was alarming was that Fraser had mentioned, without apparently understanding the significance of it, that a man from the county land office had come around asking about his eastern boundary survey the week prior. Evelyn had known, the instant Caleb relayed this, what it meant. A manufactured survey dispute, the same method Burke had tried against Black Creek 4 years ago. Small, technical, deniable, and if successful, a way to insert a legal encumbrance on Fraser's property at exactly the moment when Fraser's cash position was most vulnerable. The encumbrance wouldn't need to hold up. It just needed to make Fraser's situation complicated enough that he might be willing to sell. To Burke's representative, at Burke's price, simply to make the complication go away. It's not about Fraser, she said to Caleb when he'd finished telling her. They were standing in the study where he kept his ledgers and his maps. The survey of the territory spread out on the desk between them. It never was. Fraser is the instrument. The target is your southwest access. Yes. Then we go to Fraser directly. She looked at the map. Not to buy him out. That's what Burke expects. And it would just create a different kind of encumbrance. We go to him with a lawyer and a proper boundary survey that we commission ourselves before Burke's manufactured version has time to become official record. That costs money. Less than losing Southwest access costs. He looked at her for a moment. I know a surveyor in the county seat, he said. Straight man. He's done work for me before. How fast can he move? If I ride tomorrow, he could be here by Friday. Then ride tomorrow. He did. He was back by dark, and the surveyor arrived Friday morning, and what followed was 3 days of methodical, detailed boundary work that Evelyn oversaw personally, not because Caleb couldn't manage it, but because she had appointed herself the point of clarity on this, and she intended to see it through. She walked every foot of the relevant boundary with the surveyor, asked every question that needed asking, and when the documentation was complete and notarized and filed at the county seat on the following Tuesday, she sat back in her chair in the study and felt the satisfaction of a problem met before it could fully form. Caleb came and stood in the doorway of the study. Done, she said. Sam told me it went clean. It went exactly right. She looked at him. Burke will find out. He'll know we saw it coming. Good, Caleb said. That's better for everyone. She thought about this. It's a message. Yes. Well, will he accept it, or will he find another angle? He'll find another angle eventually, Caleb said. Men like Burke always do, but they move to easier targets first, and we've just made this one considerably less easy. He paused. And he knows now that you're part of this, which changes his calculation. Why? He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, something that was both serious and warm, which was a combination she hadn't realized his face could hold simultaneously until this moment. Because you're the reason we saw it coming, he said. He knows that. He'll understand that I'm less exposed than I was before. She looked at him steadily. There was something in the way he'd said less exposed, carefully, as if the exposure itself was a condition he'd been living with long enough that naming it required effort. You were exposed, she said. Not a question. Yes. He came fully into the room and stood by the desk, looking at the filed copies of the survey documentation. Alone, you're exposed, no matter how well you've built, because there's only one set of eyes, only one mind on the problem. And He paused, and she heard him working towards something. I had stopped thinking of that as a problem. I'd made peace with it. I told myself it was strength, needing no one, not being vulnerable. And now? She asked, quietly. He looked up from the documents. His face was open in the way she had seen it become over the past weeks. Not fully, not without cost, but open. The door in the wall. Now I think I was wrong about what strength looks like, he said. The evening that followed was not what she had planned, and yet felt afterward exactly as it should have been. They had supper in the usual way, and Martha went to her quarters in the usual way, and they were left in the kitchen in the usual way, except that nothing about it felt usual. The air in the room had a different quality. They both felt it. She was certain of that, not from anything performed, but from the particular quality of the silences, the way they moved a fraction less carefully around each other. The way the normal, slight distance between them when they were both in the same space had compressed imperceptibly towards something closer. She was washing the supper dishes. Martha always left the supper dishes for morning, but Evelyn had never managed to leave things undone overnight. It wasn't in her. And he had stayed at the table rather than going to the study as he usually did. And she was aware of him there the way you were aware of heat from a good fire. Not oppressive, but undeniable. My father needs a purpose, she said, because she had been thinking about it for weeks, and she had decided tonight was the moment to raise it. He's better than he was in the spring, but he's drifting, and a man who drifts without work turns into a man who can't remember who he was. I know, Caleb said. She turned from the sink. You've been thinking about it too. Since June. He had his hands around his coffee cup. The north fence line needs a crew foreman for the fall reinforcement work. It's not a grand thing, but it's real work that matters, and it requires the kind of experience he has. She looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her chest with a quality she recognized from the earlier weeks. The warmth of being seen, of having the thing you hadn't yet asked for already considered. She had come to Black Creek Ranch braced for erasure. She had found instead a man who kept paying attention. "You were going to offer it to him," she said. "I was waiting to see if you wanted to raise it or whether I should. You were giving me the first move." "Yes." She turned back to the dishes because she needed a moment that he couldn't see her face through. She finished them carefully, dried her hands, and then turned and leaned against the kitchen counter and looked at him. Caleb. His name, his first name, the one she had used only once before and which still felt like stepping off a familiar trail onto new ground. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." He set down the coffee cup. "All right. What is this?" She said it plainly, without softening. "What is this, between us? What do you think it is?" The question sat in the kitchen air between them. He didn't flinch from it. He held it the way he held everything, with his full, unhurried attention. And she watched him arrive at the answer the way you watched a man take a difficult fence, with deliberation and then with commitment. "I think," he said slowly, "that it's the most real thing that's happened to me in 20 years. He said it without drama, without performance, in the plain voice of a man stating a fact he had worked hard to be certain of. "I think you came here and changed the weather. That's the only way I know how to say it. You changed the weather of this place, the house, the work." A pause, and his voice dropped a fraction but held steady. "Me," she breathed. "I'm not practiced at this," he said again, as he had said on the night of the storm. "I don't know how to offer things. I spent so long not having anything to offer besides the ranch and the work that I—" "Stop," she said, quietly but with absolute authority. He stopped. She pushed off from the counter and walked to the table and sat down across from him, closer than she normally sat, close enough that the lamp between them was to the side rather than between, and she could see his face without the soft obstruction of the light. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to hear it clearly because I don't say things I don't mean, and I won't repeat it for the sake of drama." He looked at her. "I didn't come here to endure this marriage," she said. "I told myself I did. I prepared for endurance the way you'd prepare for a difficult winter, laying in provisions, buttoning up, getting ready to survive it. And then I got here and I found—" She let herself be as honest as she was asking him to be. "I found you. Not the legend, you. The man who has the armchair placed right by the east window and gives a woman her own room with a bolt on the door and rides out to protect a neighbor before the threat is fully formed. The man who taught himself to read from a surveying manual and who hasn't raised his voice in the 3.5 months I've lived in this house." She held his gaze. "That man." He was very still. "I didn't choose this marriage," she said. "The circumstances chose it. But I am—" She took a breath. "I am choosing it now. I'm choosing you. Not because I'm obligated to, not because the debt is paid and I have nowhere to go, because this is the most honest life I've lived since I was young enough to live without strategy, and you are the reason for it. And I am 50 years old, and I have spent too many years being sufficient to waste the years I have left on anything less than what this is." The silence that followed was the longest silence she had ever sat inside. And then Caleb Draven, the most feared man in the territory, the man the town had built a legend around made of cold iron and unmerciful will, the man who had been alone for 20 years and had made a religion of it, put his face in his hands, not dramatically, not with the performance of grief, with the utter simplicity of a man who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had been given, at last, permission to set it down. She said nothing. She did not reach for him or look away. She simply sat there and let him have the moment, which was the most genuinely kind thing she knew how to do. After a moment, he lowered his hands. His eyes were dry, but the expression on his face was something she had never seen there, and suspected few people ever had. Unguarded, stripped of every layer of management, completely present. I don't know how to do this, he said, and this time it came from somewhere different than it had come from before. Not a warning, not a disclaimer, but an honest declaration of a man standing at the edge of new territory and asking, implicitly, not to cross it alone. I know, she said. Neither do I. We'll be bad at it sometimes. Probably. And we'll be honest about that, too. Yes. He looked at her. Yes. We will. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the deliberate, conscious gesture of a woman who had made up her mind. And his hand turned under hers and held on with a grip that was not desperate but was very sure. The grip of a man who recognized something worth holding and intended to. They sat like that for a while, in the warm kitchen of the ranch he had built from nothing, while the July night moved its slow way across the high plateau and the creek ran full from the week's rain and the horses stood quiet in the barn and the land held itself under the stars with the patient permanence of things that had been here long before either of them and would be here long after. It was not a young love, it was not a frictionless thing, and it did not pretend to be. It was the love of two people who had arrived at it from the far side of long experience, who had both been worn down and built back up and worn down again by the particular demands of lives lived in full, and who had therefore come to it not with illusions, but with something considerably more valuable, the knowledge of what mattered and what didn't, the wisdom to recognize the real thing when it appeared, and the courage, hard-won and specific, to choose it anyway. The following morning, Evelyn rode to the Mercer ranch and told her father about the foreman position. Thomas Mercer sat at his kitchen table with his coffee and listened, and when she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. "It's not charity," he said. It was not entirely a question. "It's not charity," she confirmed. "The fence line needs a crew foreman, and you have 30 years of experience that qualify you directly. The fact that it's us offering it is circumstance, not charity." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Does Draven? It was his idea, she said. Her father looked up. His idea, she repeated. He raised it before I did. He's been thinking about it since June. Thomas Mercer was quiet for another long moment, and she watched him work through it. The complicated, layered thing it was, the pride and the debt and the shame and the relief and the gradual, effortful arrival at something that could be accepted with dignity because it was offered with dignity. "All right," he said finally. "All right, I'll do it." She rode back to Black Creek in the early afternoon with the particular lightness of someone who has resolved a long-held weight. The summer range was brilliant green from the week's rain, and the sky above the hills was the deep blue of midsummer, and the road was good under the horses' feet, and she felt the July air on her face and thought about all of it. Her father with work that mattered again, the survey documentation that had closed Burke's angle, Caleb's face in the lamplight when she had put her hand over his. Sam met her at the gate. "Mr. Draven's up in the north pasture," he said. "Asked me to tell you when you got back." She nodded. "How long has he been up there?" "Since noon. He had a letter this morning from someone in Gray Bend." Sam's expression was careful. He didn't say what was in it. She felt the small contraction of readiness, the thing her body did when it registered that something required attention. "Thank you, Sam." She changed horses and rode north. She found him at the boundary of the north pasture, sitting his horse on the high ground above the creek line, looking out over the range with the stillness of a man who had been thinking hard and had arrived somewhere he hadn't fully expected. He heard her approach and turned, and she read his face before he spoke. Not closed, not the controlled blankness of his public manner, but tight, carrying something. "What was in the letter?" she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and held it out. She took it and read it. It was short. It was from a solicitor in Gray Bend, and it informed Caleb Draven that Aldous Burke had filed a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Commission challenging the legitimacy of the Black Creek Ranch deed on the original 60-acre homestead parcel, the very first land Caleb had ever registered 23 years ago, the foundation on which everything else had been built. The grounds cited were a procedural irregularity in the original filing, which the complaint alleged had been improperly executed and was therefore voidable. She read it twice. Then she folded it and handed it back. "It's a bluff," she said. "Maybe. Not maybe. He doesn't have the procedural irregularity because if a real one existed, he would have used it years ago. This is a manufactured challenge designed to cloud the deed while he maneuvers something else. She looked at the range below them, the acres and acres of land that had been built from a young man's stubborn will and 23 years of hard work. He's trying to destabilize you, make you defensive, get you reacting instead of acting. I know. Caleb's voice was even, but carrying something underneath. She heard it clearly by now, the thing that lived under his control, the rare occasions it surfaced. You're angry, she said. Yes. Good. Be angry. And then let's go home and respond from somewhere other than angry. He looked at her sharply, not with irritation, with the slightly off-balance look of a man whose own wisdom is being returned to him from an unexpected direction. You've known this ranch for 23 years, she said, every foot of it. You know where that original deed was filed, and you know every document attached to it. We're going to pull those records tonight, and we're going to know more about that 60-acre parcel than Burke's solicitor has had time to invent. And then we're going to respond through the correct legal channel with the kind of documentation that makes manufactured challenges look exactly like what they are. She held his gaze. He picked the wrong target. He did it before, with the water rights. He's doing it again. Caleb sat his horse and looked at her for a long moment. The north pasture spread below them, the cattle moving slowly in the afternoon heat, the creek bright at the lower edge. 23 years of building, one original 60-acre homestead that he had earned with one season's labor, and the entire force of a young man who had decided he was going to matter in this territory, regardless of what it cost him. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. They rode back to the ranch together, through the long summer afternoon, and the horses moved easily on the familiar road, and she thought about what it meant, this thing they were doing, the two of them, the working and the building and the protecting and the occasional hard, honest conversation that held it all together. She thought about what she had said the night before, in the kitchen, about choosing, about the difference between what the circumstances had made and what she had decided to make of it. She thought about her mother's garden, which was still growing at the Mercer Ranch under her father's now attentive care, and about the armchair by the east window that caught the morning light, and about the bolt on the inside of the door that she had not used in 6 weeks. She had stopped using it somewhere in June without consciously deciding to. She had simply come upstairs one evening and not reached for it, and gone to bed and slept deeply. And in the morning, the not bolting had already become habitual, had already become one of the small, unremarkable facts of a life she was building rather than enduring. The gate of Black Creek Ranch came into view. The main house stood square and solid against the afternoon sky, its windows catching light, smoke beginning from the kitchen chimney where Martha would be starting supper. Sam was in the yard. 2 of the hands were coming in from the east range. The whole apparatus of the place moving in its established rhythm, the rhythm she had absorbed and in some places changed and in some places simply joined, all of it bearing the mark of Caleb Draven's will and, now, hers. She rode through the gate at a walk, and the gate swung closed behind her with a sound she had come to know as well as any sound in her memory. And she was home. That evening, they pulled the original deed records and spent 3 hours at the study desk going through every document with the focused thoroughness of people who understood that precision was its own form of power. Martha brought them supper on a tray without comment because Martha had learned to read the working sessions by now and knew that interruption was not welcome. Caleb walked her through every step of the original filing, the year, the method, the officials involved, the subsequent confirmations that had been issued over 2 decades. There was no procedural irregularity. There never had been. The filing was clean and complete, and Multiply confirmed by subsequent territorial records that predated Burke's complaint by years. We respond Monday, Evelyn said when they had been through everything twice. I want the solicitor in Graybend, your solicitor, the one you trust, to have a complete packet of documentation on his desk first thing Monday morning. Burke filed his complaint on a Thursday. We're not going to let it sit over a weekend and let him think he's rattled us. I'll write to Hendricks tonight. Good. She leaned back in the chair and let the tiredness of the evening settle into her bones, which was a different kind of tiredness than the anxiety tiredness she had been living with for years before. This was the tiredness of genuine work, of a problem engaged and moving toward resolution. Caleb was closing the ledgers and sorting the documents back into their order, and she watched his hands do the familiar, precise work, and she felt the warmth of the room and the lamplight and the particular quality of this specific silence. Two people who had been through something together and were resting inside the fact of having been through it together, which was its own kind of intimacy. "Thank you," he said, without looking up from the documents. "For what specifically?" He looked up then. "For not letting me ride down to Greybend tonight and find Burke." She held his gaze. "Is that what you wanted to do?" "For about an hour this afternoon," he said honestly. "Yes." "And now?" "Now I want to bury him in documentation until there's nothing left of the complaint to stand on, which is considerably more satisfying and considerably less criminal." "That's the right answer," she said. He almost smiled. The quiet, warm, fully real version of it that she had seen for the first time 3 weeks ago, and that had, since then, appeared more regularly, as if the muscle for it was being exercised back into use. "I know," he said. She stood and gathered her own notes from the desk, and she moved past him toward the door of the study, and his hand came out and touched her arm. Not grabbing, not restraining, the lightest touch. A question more than a statement, and she stopped. She turned. He looked at her in the lamplight of the study, surrounded by 23 years of careful records, in the house he had built and she had begun to fill with the particular life she brought to it, and he said very quietly, "I'm glad you came." She looked at him. 50 years old, she thought. The two of them, standing in a study full of ledgers in a ranch house in the middle of a territory that had never promised anyone anything, and yet here they were, with all of this. The work and the honesty and the hand over his at the kitchen table and the warmth that had been building all summer like a fire with good fuel, burning steadily and throwing real heat. "So am I," she said. She went upstairs and the east window was dark with the summer night, and the armchair was in its place, and the bolt was on the inside of the door, unused. She didn't even glance at it. The letter to Hendricks went out Saturday morning, carried by one of the faster hands on the best horse in the stable, with instructions to wait for a written acknowledgement of receipt and bring it back before nightfall. Evelyn had written the cover letter herself, not because Caleb's legal instincts were poor, they were in fact quite sound, but because she had a particular gift for the kind of language that was simultaneously correct and unmistakably firm, the language that communicated to a receiving party that the people on the other end of the correspondence were not confused about their position and were not going to become confused about it. She had learned this skill from 15 years of writing letters to creditors, suppliers, and county officials on behalf of a ranch that could not afford to appear vulnerable. Caleb had read what she wrote before she sealed it and said nothing, which she had come to understand was his specific form of approval, the absence of amendment. The acknowledgement came back before sundown. Hendricks would have the full packet reviewed by Monday morning and a formal response filed by Tuesday. He added, in a brief postscript in his own hand, that the complaint as described had the hallmarks of a nuisance filing rather than a substantive legal challenge, and that he had dealt with Burke's solicitor before on matters of this nature and was not concerned. "Not concerned," Caleb read aloud, and his voice had a dry quality she hadn't heard in it before. Dry and slightly amused, which was a combination she found quietly delightful because it meant he was relaxing into something he'd been braced against all weekend. "Hendricks is a careful man," she said. "If he says not concerned, he's not concerned. He's also never had Burke come at him from this direction before." "No, but you have the records, and the records are clean." She looked at him across the supper table. "Burke is fishing. He threw a line, and we're going to cut it before it sets." Caleb looked at the letter for another moment, and then set it face down on the table with a finality that meant he was done carrying it tonight, which was its own kind of progress. She had noticed, in the weeks she had known him, that he tended to hold problems past the point where holding them did any good, turning them over in the private machinery of his mind long after the useful thinking was done, running on the grinding energy of unresolved anxiety the way a man ran a piece of equipment past its service point out of stubbornness or habit. She had been gently interrupting that pattern when she could, and he had been, with the particular grace of a man who recognized a better way of doing something and was willing to adopt it, letting her. "Tell me about your grandfather," she said, which was a deliberate pivot, the kind she had learned to make when he needed to be moved away from a thing that was pulling him in circles. He looked up. Why? Because you've never talked about him, and I want to know. He considered this for a moment, as he considered everything, and then something in him settled, and he said, he was a stubborn Scotsman who crossed the Atlantic with $11 and a mule and no plan whatsoever. And then he talked for 40 minutes, which was the longest uninterrupted personal narrative she had ever heard from him, and she listened to every word with the full attention of a woman who understood that a man who had spent decades not being listened to needed to be listened to with complete seriousness when he finally opened the door. By the time Martha appeared to clear the table, the Burke letter was still face down where Caleb had put it, and something lighter had taken its place in the room, and Evelyn sat with her tea and felt the particular satisfaction of a good evening, honest and warm and entirely ungoverned by performance, which was the only kind of evening she had any patience for anymore. Hendricks filed the response Tuesday. By Thursday, Burke's solicitor had written back with what amounted, once the legal language was stripped away, to a retreat. The procedural irregularity they had cited turned out, under examination of the actual documents, to be not an irregularity at all, but a different filing format that had been standard practice in the territory during the relevant year and was thoroughly supported by precedent. Hendricks' letter said so with the calm precision of a man who had been doing this for 30 years and knew exactly how to take apart a manufactured argument without raising his voice. Caleb brought the letter to Evelyn in the garden. She had been working on the expansion of the kitchen garden, which she had been planning since June and had finally had time to begin laying out properly. She was on her knees in the dirt when he came around the corner of the house, which was not a position she particularly minded being found in, because there was nothing undignified about honest work, and she had never thought otherwise. She read the letter kneeling in the dirt, and then sat back on her heels and looked at the sky for a moment. "It's done," she said. "This angle is done," he said, which was the accurate version. "Burke doesn't give up, he regroups. Then we stay prepared." She stood and dusted her hands on her work apron. "But we don't spend the time waiting for him fighting ghosts. We build. We keep closing the gaps. And when he finds another angle, we see it coming, and we cut it the same way." He looked at her with the direct, warm attention that had become, over these months, the look she associated most essentially with him. Not the controlled blankness of his public manner, not the hawk's assessment of the first days, but this, the look of a man who was fully present, fully engaged, and entirely without the defensive distance he had maintained for 20 years. "You changed how I think about this ranch," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "In what way?" "I've always thought of it as something to protect, something I built and needed to keep from being taken." He paused. "You think of it as something to grow." She considered this. "Is that wrong?" "No." He looked out over the garden, the new beds she had laid out, the expanded footprint of what had been, until recently, a practical but minimal space. "It's better." She smiled at him, the real one, not the controlled courtesy smile she deployed for difficult situations, but the one that came from somewhere genuine and that she had been, over the summer, increasingly willing to let him see. "Then let's grow it." Her father arrived at Black Creek Ranch on the first Monday of August, driving his own wagon, wearing the good hat he'd bought in Grey Bend on Evelyn's suggestion, and carrying himself with the particular posture of a man who has been given something to stand up for again. Sam met him in the yard and walked him through the North Pasture fence project with the matter-of-fact respect of one working man for another, and Thomas Mercer listened and asked the right questions, and by the end of the first afternoon had the measure of the work and the men doing it, and had begun, quietly, to be useful. Evelyn watched this from the south porch without involving herself. That was important. He needed to find his footing on his own terms, without her managing the process, which would have reduced him to a visitor in her household rather than a man in his own right. She had thought carefully about this. She had talked to Caleb about it, who had understood immediately and said only, "I'll tell Sam to treat him as the foreman from day one, not as a guest being evaluated," which was exactly right. By the end of the first week, her father was taking his meals with the hands in the working kitchen and had earned, through the direct channel of competence and a willingness to work shoulder to shoulder rather than direct from a distance, the beginning of their respect. Evelyn saw this from various vantage points, and felt something unclenching in her chest that had been quietly clenched since that spring morning when her father had come up the road with hollow eyes and his hat in his hands. She went to find him on the Friday evening of that first week, at the end of the workday when the hands were washing up and the light was going long and gold over the North Range. He was at the fence line, his hands on the top rail, looking out over the pasture with an expression she recognized from her own mirror, the look of a person recalibrating, finding their level after a long time off balance. "Papa," she said, coming up beside him. "Evie." He had called her that when she was small. He had stopped when she was 12 or 13, when she had informed him with the absolute authority of a child who has decided to be taken seriously that she preferred Evelyn. He had used it just now without thinking, and she let it stand because it was a gift, even small ones. "How is it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said, and she heard in that single word the compressed weight of everything it covered. The relief, the gratitude he didn't know how to speak directly, the pride beginning to reassemble itself around the new shape of his circumstances. "The men are good. The work is real." He paused. "Draven stopped by the line this afternoon. Didn't say much. Just looked at what we'd done and nodded. That's how he shows approval." I gathered. Her father glanced at her. "He's not what I thought he was." "No," she agreed. "He isn't." Thomas Mercer looked at his daughter. All of her. The whole of who she was and what she had done and what she had made of the impossible situation he had handed her. And his eyes went wet in the way of old men whose feelings had moved closer to the surface as the years wore them thinner. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She put her hand on his arm. "Come to Sunday supper this week," she said. "Martha's been planning it since Tuesday." He laughed, a short, surprised sound. "She already told me." "She runs this household," Evelyn said. "She just lets the rest of us think we have opinions." She left him at the fence line with the evening coming in gold over the range, and she walked back to the main house through the warm August air and thought about what it meant to have restored something that had been broken. Not to its original shape, which was gone forever, but to a new one that carried the evidence of the break and was stronger at the repaired places, the way good metal was stronger where it had been reworked. The Sunday supper that week was the first time the full household had sat at the table together. Evelyn and Caleb, Thomas, Martha, and Sam, who had been invited with the matter-of-fact simplicity that characterized the way things at Black Creek Ranch happened under Evelyn's management, without ceremony, without making the invitation larger than it was, with the basic assumption that people who had earned a place at a table should be at it. Martha had cooked for 2 days. She would never have admitted this, but the evidence was in the results. 3 courses of food that was simultaneously practical and extraordinary, the kind of cooking that announced itself as effort while pretending to be effortless. Caleb ate with the appetite of a man who had never stopped appreciating real food, and her father found his second helping without being urged, and Sam told a story about a horse that had gotten into the equipment barn that somehow became funnier each time the details were amended, and Evelyn sat at the table she had set herself and looked around at the faces in the lamplight and felt something she recognized after a moment as the complete and uncomplicated experience of being exactly where she was supposed to be. She caught Caleb's eye across the table. He was watching her with the quiet attention that was his natural mode, and she saw in his face the same recognition she was feeling, turned slightly differently by the angle of his particular history with it, the specific gratitude of a man who had spent a long time in a house that was not a home and was only now understanding the difference. She held his gaze for a moment. He held hers back. Martha caught this from her end of the table and looked immediately and determinedly elsewhere, which was the closest thing to a blessing Martha Aldrin was capable of delivering. The Burke situation resolved itself in the second week of August, and it resolved in a way that none of them had planned but that Evelyn, in retrospect, should have anticipated. Because the thing about pressure applied from multiple directions simultaneously is that it doesn't always produce the result the person applying it intends. Sometimes it produces a fracture in the apparatus doing the applying. Burke's solicitor was a man named Garvey, youngish, ambitious, and as it turned out, not entirely without a conscience, which was the one variable Burke had failed to fully account for. What Garvey had discovered in the course of preparing the deed challenge documentation was that the procedural records Burke had provided him as the basis for the complaint had been altered. Not slightly, substantially. Someone, and the trail of it pointed, with increasing clarity, toward Burke's own land office contact in the county, had doctored the filing date records to manufacture the irregularity that didn't exist in the genuine documents. Document fraud. In a territorial land commission proceeding, Garvey, faced with the choice between filing documents he now knew to be fraudulent and withdrawing from the case, had chosen withdrawal, and had done something Burke had not anticipated, which was that he had also, quietly and through the correct channel, informed the Territorial Land Commission of what he had found. Hendricks brought this to Caleb and Evelyn on a Wednesday afternoon in the third week of August, and he delivered the information with the contained satisfaction of a man who has been dealing with Aldous Burke's maneuvers for years and has been waiting for exactly this kind of development. He overreached, Hendricks said, sitting at the study desk with his hands folded. He's done this kind of thing before, but he's always been careful enough to keep the manufactured evidence at a remove, through intermediaries, through people he has leverage over. This time the intermediary got cold feet. What happens now? Evelyn asked. The Land Commission will investigate. That investigation will take time. These things always do. But the complaint against Black Creek is effectively dead because Garvey's withdrawal and disclosure have made it impossible to proceed without the Commission examining the documentation itself, which will not survive examination. Hendricks paused. More importantly, Burke is now the subject of a formal inquiry. He's not finished. Men like Burke are never finished. And he has resources and connections that will slow the process considerably. But he is occupied. And an occupied Burke is a Burke who is not looking for new angles. After Hendricks left, Evelyn stood on the south porch and looked out at the August range and let the news settle into her the way good news needed to settle. Not with celebration, because celebration was premature, and she had lived long enough to know that premature celebration was how you got caught off guard by the next thing. But with the solid, grounded satisfaction of a battle engaged on the right terms and won the right way. Caleb came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything immediately, which was his way, and she didn't fill the silence, which was hers. And they stood together in the late afternoon light with the ranch spread out below them and the hills blue in the distance and the creek catching the sun in bright cold points. He'll be back, she said eventually. Maybe not this year, maybe not next, but men like Burke don't retire gracefully. No, Caleb agreed. They don't. Then we stay ready. She looked at him. And we keep building. Every gap we close is a gap he can't exploit. Every relationship we build in this territory is a relationship he can't manufacture a tool from. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I want to do something. She waited. Ellis Fraser's note comes due in 6 weeks. The bank isn't going to extend it. They were already being difficult about it before any of this started. He turned to look at her. I want to offer him a fair refinancing, not a buyout, not a favor. A business arrangement, lower rate, longer term, secured against the property in a way that protects him instead of exposing him. She looked at him carefully. That's not Black Creek's usual line of business. No. He held her gaze. It's not. You'd be taking on risk. Fraser's a good rancher. The risk is manageable. He paused. And it closes the angle permanently. If his note is held by us on fair terms, Burke can't get at him. She considered this for a moment. The pragmatic dimension of it, the strategic dimension, and the other dimension, the one that was harder to name, the one that had to do with a man deciding to use the thing he'd built not just to protect himself, but to protect someone else, which was a different use of power than the one he'd spent 20 years practicing. You're not just doing it for the strategic value, she said. He met her eyes. No, he said honestly. I'm not. She looked at him for a long moment. Then do it, she said. Do it right. Have Hendricks draw the terms so they're fair and clean, and Fraser can see that they're fair and clean. Don't make him feel obligated. Make him feel like he's doing business with someone who means him no harm. I know how to do it. I know you do. She put her hand briefly on his arm, the gesture she had been making for weeks now, the particular touch that was neither dramatic nor insignificant, but simply present, simply real. I'm agreeing, not instructing. He covered her hand with his. "I know," he said. The Fraser arrangement was made in September, handled through Hendricks with the straightforward professionalism Evelyn had specified, and Ellis Fraser had sat across the desk from Caleb in Hendricks' office and read the terms twice, and then looked up with an expression that was not quite disbelief and not quite gratitude, but lived somewhere between them. "Why?" Fraser said. Simply, directly, the way men asked questions when they genuinely needed the answer. Caleb had said, "Because fair terms make better neighbors than bad ones," which was true, and was also not the whole of it, and Fraser seemed to understand both of those things simultaneously, because he had nodded in the way of a man receiving a real answer and extended his hand. Word traveled, as it always did in a territory where the distances between ranches were measured in hours of hard riding, but the distances between stories were considerably shorter. The nature of the arrangement, a fair refinancing offered to a struggling neighbor, clean terms, no strings, circulated through Gray Bend and across the surrounding range in the particular way of information that contradicted a prevailing narrative. Slowly at first, and then with the accelerating momentum of a story people wanted to tell. Evelyn heard it from 3 different sources in the space of 2 weeks, each time rendered slightly differently, each rendering adding or losing some detail, but the essential fact remaining consistent. Caleb Draven had helped Ellis Fraser without extracting advantage. This information passed through the territory and did something to the architecture of Caleb's reputation that 20 years of deliberate myth-building had not been able to do. It introduced ambiguity into the legend, which was the first step toward replacing it with something more accurate. She told him this one evening in early October, when the heat had gone out of the summer and the hills were beginning to show the first rust and gold of the turning season. "They're talking about you differently," she said. He looked up from his book. "How differently?" "Less frightened, more," she considered the right word, "respectful. Actually respectful. Not the respect that's fear wearing a different coat." He was quiet for a moment. "Does it feel different to you, from the outside?" "Yes." She put down her own book. "You know what's interesting? I think it feels different to you, too. I think you're carrying something lighter these days, and you've noticed it even if you haven't said so." He looked at her steadily. Then, with the honesty that had become the ground of everything between them, "Yes, I've noticed." "The reputation served its purpose," she said, "and now it doesn't have to anymore. Because you're not building from nothing now. You're not one bad season from the edge. You're established, you're solvent, you have—" She paused, and the pause had weight. "People." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said quietly. "I do." October deepened, and with it came the particular work of the season, the fall cattle sale, the winterizing of the ranch infrastructure, the assessment of the year's results, and the planning of the next. Evelyn moved through all of it in the natural rhythm of a woman who had found her pace and was no longer working against the grain of her circumstances. She and Martha had expanded the kitchen garden successfully enough that they had excess produce to trade with 2 neighboring properties, which had been Evelyn's intent. Not for the produce itself, but for the relationship. For the simple commerce of neighbors exchanging things of value, which was a different kind of currency than money, and often more durable. Thomas Mercer had finished the north fence line 3 weeks ahead of schedule, which Sam had reported to Caleb with the satisfied tone of a man whose judgment about a hire had been vindicated. And Caleb had gone to Thomas directly to say so, which had been the right thing, and which Evelyn had not asked him to do. He had simply done it. She had learned, over the months, to notice these things, not the gestures that he made because she had asked or suggested, but the ones he made independently, out of his own compass, because they were right. They told her more about who he was than any amount of deliberate demonstration could have. Her father had, over the course of the summer and into the fall, become something she hadn't fully anticipated. A fixture. Not just at the ranch, but in the life of the household, at Sunday suppers, at the occasional evening when Evelyn and Caleb rode to the Mercer Ranch for the kind of ordinary visit between family that had seemed, in the desperate spring of that year, like a future too fragile to trust. One evening in mid-October, she overheard her father and Caleb talking on the south porch. She had not intended to overhear. She had come to bring them tea and had paused at the sound of her father's voice through the open window. Not to eavesdrop, but because the quality of the conversation reached her before she could announce herself, and she had stood for a moment, her hand on the door, and listened. They were talking about the original Mercer homestead. Her father was describing how her grandfather had chosen the location, the specific calculation of water access and grazing terrain, and prevailing wind direction that had gone into the decision, the particular reading of the land that her grandfather had done before he turned a single shovel of earth. And Caleb was listening with the complete attention she knew well, asking precise questions about the water table and the seasonal variation of the creek, questions that were genuinely interested and that her father was answering with the animated authority of a man talking about something he loved and knew completely. She stood at the door for a moment and felt something she could not immediately name, something that was happiness, but the specific kind of happiness that arrived not in moments of joy exactly, but in moments of recognition, when you saw the shape of what your life had become and understood that it was, by any honest measure, good. She pushed open the door. "Open the tea," she said, and set down the tray, and her father glanced up and smiled, and Caleb's hand came briefly to the small of her back as she settled into the chair beside him, a gesture so natural and undemonstrated that neither of them remarked on it, which was itself the truest measure of what they had built. The question of the room, the corner room with the east window and the bolt on the inside of the door that had not been used since June, had resolved itself in the unhurried, unannounced way of things between two careful people who were both unwilling to move faster than honesty allowed. She was still in that room, technically, but the hallway between her door and the end of the hall where his was had ceased to feel like a boundary somewhere in August, had become instead simply a part of the house, a corridor between two spaces that both belonged to the same life. There had been no announcement, no formal conversation about it. They were not people who performed their intimacy or announced their private decisions to each other with declarations, which would have felt foreign to both of them, like wearing clothes that fit someone else. There had instead been an evening in late September when a thunderstorm came through fast and violent, and she had found herself on the landing in the dark, reaching for the lamp, and he had been there, and they had stood for a moment in the narrow space of the landing while the storm threw rain against the windows, and the distance between them had closed in the simple way of something that had been moving toward completion for months, and had finally, in that unremarkable moment, completed. It was not a dramatic thing. It was, in fact, the least dramatic thing she could imagine. Two people in the dark finding each other in the middle of a storm, which was in many ways exactly what they had been doing all along, in every version of the word finding. Afterward, lying in the dark with the storm still running over the roof of the house he had built, and she had come to love, she had said, "I want to tell you something I haven't told you yet." "All right," he said. "I was afraid," she said, "when I came here. Not of you. I sorted that out fairly quickly. I was afraid of becoming invisible, of being absorbed, of losing the woman I'd been for 50 years into someone else's story." He was quiet beside her, listening in the full way she trusted. "I want you to know that the opposite happened," she said. "I want you to know that because I think you've been careful with me in a way that cost you things, in a way that required a lot of restraint from a man who is not naturally patient with things that feel uncertain. And I want you to know that I saw that, I see it, and it mattered." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You were never going to be invisible. You're not built that way." "I know, but I didn't know if this would let me be visible." He turned toward her in the dark, and she could feel the full weight of his attention, even without seeing his face, the complete presence of him that was one of the things she had come to value most about being close to him, the absolute absence of distraction, the way he was entirely where he was. "You're the most visible thing I've ever had in my life," he said. The winter came early to the high plateau that year, a fact that Evelyn had predicted from the behavior of the cattle in late October, and that the hands had noted with the mixed feelings of men who respected accurate weather prediction but would have preferred less accurate predictions when they favored early cold. The first snow came in the second week of November, not a hard snow, but real, covering the range in the thin white coat of early winter and bringing with it the particular quiet that snow imposed on open country. Evelyn stood on the south porch in the morning of the first snow and breathed the cold air and watched it come down in the soft, unhurried way of early season snow that wasn't trying to prove anything yet. The ranch yard was already in motion. Sam's voice from the direction of the barn, the smell of smoke from the bunkhouse stove, two of the hands moving efficiently across the yard on the morning tasks. Her father's wagon, which he parked now on the east side of the yard when he came for his working days, sitting patient under a thin white coat. Caleb came out and stood beside her, bringing coffee, and they stood together on the south porch of Black Creek Ranch and watched the first winter snow fall on everything they had built. "Burke," she said. Not with anxiety, just placing the name in the winter air, acknowledging what was still out there, still circling at a remove. "The Land Commission investigation continues," he said. "Hendricks says it'll run into spring at least. Burke's lawyers are doing what they're paid to do." He paused. "It won't undo anything that's already been done. Whatever sanctions come, they'll be for the document fraud, not for anything touching this ranch. He'll find another angle eventually. Yes. And we'll see it coming. Yes." He looked at her. "We will." She heard the "we" with the same clarity she always heard it now. Not as a word she had decided to use, but as a word that was simply accurate, simply the correct description of what existed. She took the coffee he offered, and their hands were close on the cup in the cold air, and neither of them stepped back from that proximity, which they had not been stepping back from for 2 months now. "There's something I want to do in the spring," she said. "Tell me." "I want to bring my mother's roses here." She had been thinking about it since September, when she had gone to the Mercer Ranch and looked at her mother's garden and understood that her father was maintaining it out of duty and love, but that she was the one who knew what to do with it, who could bring it into the full life it was capable of. "They're old plants. My mother planted them the year she married. They've survived everything, drought, bad winters, 15 years of me looking after them instead of her. I want them here, in the east-facing bed where they'll get the morning light." He was quiet for a moment. She knew his silences well enough now to read the different varieties of them. This one was the thinking and arriving silence, the one that meant he was locating his own feeling about something before he answered. "Your mother's roses," he said. "Yes." "On the east side of the house." "Where they'll do best," she said. "Where they belong." He looked at her steadily, in the full, unhurried way of a man for whom seeing clearly had become, over the past months, both a habit and something closer to a need. "Yes," he said, "bring them." She nodded once, with the decisive satisfaction of a decision made and accepted, and they stood together in the falling snow and drank their coffee and watched the ranch receive the first winter as it received everything, with the solid, unhurried permanence of something that had been built to last. That Sunday, the first Sunday of the real winter, Thomas Mercer came to supper as he always did now, and Martha had made the kind of meal that made the cold outside feel like a courtesy rather than a hardship, and Sam had brought something he'd been making in his off hours. A small carved piece of wood, a horse in motion, rough but recognizable, which he presented to no one in particular and set on the mantel with the gruff awkwardness of a man who had done a thing with feeling and was not entirely sure how to stand next to that fact. Evelyn thanked him directly and specifically, which she could see was both what he needed and slightly more than he'd prepared for. At the table, with the lamp warm and the fire real and the snow coming down outside against the dark windows, she looked at the faces assembled there. Her father, no longer the hollow-eyed man of that desperate spring morning, but a man restored to himself, perhaps more fully himself than he had been in years, because the years of grinding worry had been lifted, and what remained underneath was the person he had always been when the weight was off him. Martha, who had taken Evelyn into this household and tested her and found her worthy, and had been, in the particular way of women who would never say so aloud, a friend. Sam, who had answered her hard questions honestly when he didn't have to, and who had therefore given her, at a critical moment, exactly the information she needed to see Caleb clearly. And Caleb himself, at the head of the table, talking to her father about the spring cattle plans, his face carrying all the evidence of a summer and fall of opening, the lines of it slightly easier, the set of his shoulders carrying less of the permanent defensive readiness that had been there in the early days, the dark eyes warmer in a way that was simply visible now to anyone who knew what they were looking at. She had known, that first night on the road from the Mercer Ranch to Black Creek, that she was riding toward something unknown. She had not known whether the unknown would be survivable, had not known whether it would be livable, had held on to nothing more reliable than her own assessment of a man she had studied for 40 minutes on a porch and a lifetime of being able to read what was real. She had been right, not because she was always right. She knew her own record well enough to know that she was frequently wrong about things and freely acknowledged it, but because what she had read in him had been real, and what was real had, when given the conditions to grow, grown into this: the table and the lamp and the people at it, and the snow outside and the sound of her father's laugh, and the warmth of Caleb's hand on her shoulder as he rose to refill the coffee, the habitual ease of the gesture, the completely unself-conscious nature of it. This was what she had chosen. Not because the circumstances had forced her and she had made the best of it. That version of the story was available, and it would have been a respectable version, a story you could tell without shame. But it wasn't the true version. The true version was that she had looked at what was in front of her with all 50 years of herself, all the hard-won clarity and the practical courage and the love that had never found quite the right shape until now, and she had chosen it freely and completely. That was the true version. She intended to keep it. After supper, when the guests had gone and the house was settling into its quiet, she went to the south porch one last time. The snow had stopped and the sky had cleared to the particular brilliant black of winter nights at altitude, and the stars above the Black Creek Range burned with the fierce indifference of things that had been present since long before any of this and would continue long after. She could hear the creek somewhere in the dark, still moving under its new thin edge of ice. The sound of it, the same sound it had made for the 23 years this ranch had existed, and the unknown years before that. Caleb came and stood beside her, and they were both quiet for a moment in the cold, in the way they had been quiet together many times now. Easily, without effort, without the weight of maintained distance that silence between strangers carried. "First winter," she said. "First of many," he said. She looked up at the stars and felt the cold, and heard the creek, and thought about her mother's roses coming in the spring, and about her father at the north fence line, and about the solid handwriting in the ranch ledgers where her own additions were indistinguishable now from what had been there before, and about a man who had built a fortress out of loneliness and had, when it finally mattered, opened the door. She put her hand in his, and his fingers closed around hers in the dark, with the sureness of a man who had been practicing holding things carefully for 20 years and had finally found something worth holding completely. The stars burned over Black Creek Ranch. The creek ran under the ice. The horses stood warm in the barn. Inside the house, a lamp burned in the window, the east window, the one with the morning light, and the house held everything within it with the quiet solidity of a place that had been, at long last, fully inhabited. They stood there for a while, the two of them, in the cold and the dark, and the enormous indifferent beauty of the frontier night. Not young, not easy, not without the accumulated weight of everything it had taken to arrive here, the losses and the work and the long years of being sufficient alone. But here, together, warm at the core. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.